what we're doing here with Aristoi and modernity is a little intermission in the middle of our Millennium microcosm, and it was suggested by Ari. Hopefully, Ari finds us in response to a comment that we made about that Kenneth Smith sees one of the defining characteristics of modernity as creating a characterological flatland in which there is a place for douloi and there's a place for Banausoi, but there's no place for Aristoi, and that much of the coercive structure of modernity is built around exterminating the role of Aristoi. And so the only Aristoi who are allowed to survive are those who can pound themselves down and can do the characterological foot binding to make themselves mimic douloi or Banausoi so that they can fit into those roles. But no Aristic roles will be allowed. Um, and we're going to explore that for a few weeks before we go back
The
to Millennium
the
Micro.
Aristoi is a highly trained position.
The role is a highly trained role, and it requires a lot of support to exist. But the intrinsic character type, the potential, the teleology, the ethos of an Aristos will exist and break out from time to time, regardless of whether a role is available. And if there's no role available, then you basically have an animal who has no ecosystem. And you know what happens to animals who have no ecosystem. Uh,
But everybody would have the Aristoi persona in some form within them. It just doesn't emerge. I think this was Kierkegaard's point, wasn't it?
See, this is the thing, is there's been an enormous amount of debate in the existentialist tradition about whether that mature adult form of the mind of Homo sapiens is a potential that is in everybody from birth. Is it only in some people from birth? People can't agree on that. And if it is a potential within you, what does it take for that potential to be realized? Could it be that in some people it could be realized, but in other people it gets thwarted along the way through some maldevelopment, and then thereafter they're not able to go
Well,
that
we
way?
couldn't have too many. Star Trek made that point.
Couldn't have too
Could
many
you
errors.
imagine an entire universe full of Napoleons?
Oh, you're talking about Space Seed, and yes, but is Napoleon an Aristos, or is he something else? It's debatable, right?
No, I think we could give him that one, forgetting the point that he might have been a tyrant. What's wrong with tyrants? You're suddenly against tyrants all of a sudden, are you?
Well, we'll have time to explore this because we have some material to play with here. So one of the things I'm going to do is upload a paper. Here we go, file. I want to upload. Where is this thing? Here. No, that's not it. Give me a second. Characterological genocide. No, that's not it. Ah, I have a partially formatted book called Old World Principles from Kenneth that is about um, it's a collection of papers from across his career. And one of the papers that he wrote in 1997 is called Human Nature's Greek Philosophical Anthropology. And I finished uploading it here. Oh, it looks like David put a link as well. Let me just click on that and see what we get.
May the fourth be with you.
May the fourth be with you, indeed. Ah, yes, May the fourth. Thank you. May the fourth and with you, David. So, okay, so there's my link. This is Kenneth's paper from 1997, Human Nature's uh, uh, Greek Philosophical Anthropology, and this will walk us through the ancient Greek slash Hegelian slash Kierkegaardian slash Arendtian slash Smithian three-part um, categorization of human ethos. It's an interesting paper. He wrote it. I can't remember which group he wrote it for. He used to go to different philosophical groups and present papers from time to time, which frequently annoyed many of the other philosophers. But he kept doing it, perhaps partially out of Schadenfreude. And this was one of those. And it's you could think of it as a capsule version of a book that we'll do as follow up after we finish this seminar as a whole, on Millennium Microcosm. I think everybody pretty much decided they wanted to do the deep dive into his human characterology. So this is a teaser or a foretaste of that. Hi, Geneva. Welcome to the call. Let me give you the link that I just gave everybody else. Uploaded a file. Here it is. Go ahead and download that PDF. This is a Kenneth Smith paper called Human Natures, Greek Philosophical Anthropology. And this is where he talks about the douloi, the banausoi, and the aristoi. And as part of it, he talks a little bit about the characterological genocide that defines modernity, where modernity is exterminating the aristoi. Now, he talks about this theme of characterological genocide in many places. And David Roel, I have to thank him. He's over the last 2 weeks, from time to time, he's been sending me little snippets from various things that Kenneth wrote where he references it, and I'll share those over the course of our we're going to spend a few weeks doing this. I'll share those snippets as we go too, and you'll see the recurring theme that it's something that that concerns him a great deal. And in it, he's definitely building off Arendt and the stuff that she wrote in The Human Condition and elsewhere. He's definitely building off, as Stephen pointed out, Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard talks a lot about what is the potential within human beings to have our character grow and mature and develop through stages. Kierkegaard took that even further than Hegel did. And all of these people are building off the ancient Greek concept. I mean, and these terms, douloi, banausoi, aristoi, they're Greek. So the first distinction that we made before you joined, which I want to reiterate, is between the political economic role of one of these three things versus the human character or ethos of one of these three things. Just because you have the character to become that thing doesn't mean that society provides you with a role in which you're able to be true to your character. And what happens to people who are not given any opportunity to be true to their character is they get bent. It's like what happens to the cheetah when there's no gazelles? It's not good, right? I mean, the salmon, if there's a dam in the way with no fish ladder and the salmon can't get home to the stream, it's not good for the salmon. And so it is with each of these character types. They that this is their inner nature that they need to express. And if they are
That
not
was
given,
expressed in Jurassic Park with the Tyrannosaurus, wasn't it?
it was.
When they leave the goat tethered up to the stick, and what's his name? That character said, "Oh, well, the Tyrannosaurus, wants to chase its prey. It wants to feel the whole thing, the whole shebang."
The goat tied to a stake, it's just not going to
Yeah,
satisfy that desire.
having a meal at the end of a good day is
Yeah.
the Tyrannosaurus.
Yes. It's the same with the cats. If you just always just hand the cats the food and it's like, oh, okay, that's nice. But if you play with them first and make them chase things around, and then that really gets the juices going. They're like, yeah, I need to chase, then I need to kill, dismember, and then I eat. And if I'm missing some part of this, it's like, I don't know, what kind of meal is this? No candles, no violinist. I mean, you call this a dinner. So you're right, Stephen, and it's that's kind of the thing is that the Greek concept of character. Let's back up and do this from the beginning. I know we're being recorded and live stream. People can follow this. Let's back up and do this from the beginning. The Greek concept of character comes out of their naturalism. Remember, we talked about the three main epochs that we have documented in European history: the ancient, the medieval, and the modern. An existentialist analysis of history are based on how you prioritize three sources of meaning: nature, God, and man. And if nature is the top source of authority, and then within that the gods, and then within that mankind, then you're talking about the ancient epoch and its value system. And if you dethrone nature and put it at the bottom, and you say God created everything, including nature, and he created man, but he gave man overlordship over nature, which is what Genesis says, well, then you've got medievalism. And as Nietzsche says, if you dethrone God and you put man in charge of everything, And then you say neither nature nor God means anything. Nature is just a place where we keep our stuff so we can use to get rich. And God is just whatever we choose to do on Sundays. If that's how you orient things, then you're modern. And so the ancients, not surprisingly, don't see the world as made up of just things and stuff the way moderns do. And they don't see the world as just made up of miracles and creations the way that medievals do. They see the world as full of organisms. Everything by default is an organism, including things that we would never say is an organism, like a rock or a city. The Greeks said, well, of course, the organism is the default metaphor for everything. Life is the default metaphor for everything. When you think of a thing, think of it as an organism. And yeah, Stephen, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'd always wondered about Nietzsche. He's making that point here that, well, in a sense, we have to exercise our powers to live, to be really alive, was his point. And we can't not exercise our powers because they're meant to be exercised. And that's his point. What does not kill me makes me stronger. In other words, unless the exercise I'm doing is to the point of being destructive, it's beneficial. Prior to where it starts to destroy me, it's a balance.
Yes.
I always wondered about Nietzsche's criticism of socialism, and he said it was against life. And of course, when he talks about socialism, he would have later on he would have said included the fascists. The fascists were essentially socialists as well. But the point is, well, if you go making things too easy for people, if you hand them things which they haven't earned, it's not to their benefit because they're beings built with powers and they need to struggle in a way to exercise these powers to be what they are. There's things in human nature which are meant to be exercised. And now we're living in a world which is highly devoted to welfare, that believes the more welfare you throw at the problem, the more successful things will be. But the opposite is happening.
So you're at the opposite end of the spectrum from where I'm at. I'm trying to go back to the beginning, and
Mm.
we'll get to that. But certainly, I think Nietzsche would agree with you with your characterization of him as saying that, he's a vitalist. He's trying to be true to the ancient Greek ethos. He sees himself as an organism. He sees people and societies as organisms, and that they need to exercise their arete. They need to try to be great at the things within their character that want to express themselves. And to the extent to which that gets, sabotaged or foiled, we can't feel fully alive and satisfied. So
Well,
but
not
I'm not going to start by going into Marx and fascism. I want to start by going back to the ancient Greeks and their conception, because we're leaving out the framework that by which the Greeks got to the idea of the three character types. We're sort of
don't
skipping
think
ahead.
everybody has to develop because we a successful culture depends on the vast army of people that are willing to be Jewish. We need the servants. We need the people who are content to live in their own little space, go to work, do all the work every day, and come back home, and their joy is so personal. What's their favourite TV drama? That's a person at a particular state of being, and the vast mass of humanity live at that level.
So we'll come to that. We'll come to that. But we have to start with this concept of things as organisms, because the fundamental characteristic of an organism is that it isn't, and this is in line with what you were talking about. An organism doesn't just relate passively to the world that's around it. An organism has drives within it. It wants to exercise those drives. It needs to exercise those drives. What the acorn, whether it succeeds in becoming an oak or not, it's going to try. It needs to try to become an oak. And it's going to, if it doesn't have the resources, it can't do it. But if it has the resources available, it's going to make the most of those resources because that's its drive inside. The Greeks say to be an organism is to be in two natures, the nature around you and the nature within you. And the nature within you is your ethos, your character. And that character is a source of order for you that takes the form of a lot of drives and needs and desires to not only to act but to transform in certain characteristic ways that make you what you are. The fact that a kitten doesn't grow into an oak tree, right? It's intrinsic to its character. You have to, and this is getting to what you were talking about, Stephen. You want to recognize, you want to learn to look past the surfaces of things, to look at not just at their outer characterization, how tall are they, what color is their eyes or hair, whatever. That's the irrelevant part. The important part is what's that nature within. What is in that character, the hidden part? Because that's the thing that's going to keep surprising you until you learn what it is. That's the thing that's going to make somebody do what they do and not do what somebody else would do in that same situation. So this, to the Greeks, the concept of an organism is tied up with the concept of an ethos or a character. The inner nature, right? The nature within, and that this is the thing that is determining what the organism, to go to again to go to what you're saying, Stephen, what the organism feels most right or at home or fulfilled when it's doing. Interestingly, despite your comments about socialism, Marx himself, whether or not he would have ever agreed with any of the socialist systems set up in his name, he said that one of the most fundamental characteristics of Homo sapiens is that we are the species, like a lot of living organisms, we are a species that needs to feel like we met our needs through our own labor, that we built the house that we needed, that we made the tools that we built the house with, we grew the crops that we then ate. That sense of agency, which you're talking about, so that is fundamental to our species. And he didn't come up with this; he's borrowing it from Hegel and the Greeks. And so it's a very old idea. That's organisms want to be true to their inner nature, and if you know what that inner nature is, you can start to guess what sorts of things the organism will do. But if you don't know its inner nature, if you're just fooled by the surfaces of things, then you're going to be constantly surprised by what the organism does. And so this is what, now we're going to go to the word that I have to put money in the jar for. This is why Aristotle talks all the time about what is essential. He says most things are not essential. To be essential isn't to be important. To be essential is to be part of the character. What is essential to Stephen is what is part of his actual character, his inner drives. There could be many things about Stephen that we all look at and we observe and we think that that's important about Stephen, but we could be right or we could be wrong. The things that are most important about Stephen are what are in his character. Those are the things that are going to determine his drives and his needs and his desires, and when he feels right with the world, when he feels right with his own behavior. And if we don't understand those things, we don't know what Stephen essentially is, then Stephen's constantly going to be surprising us because we're going to be trying to predict his behavior based on inessential, i.e., non-characterological criteria, right? Like if we think it's important that he wears hats, and he shows up one day without a hat, and our jaws all drop, well, that's because we mistook the inessential to be essential. And it's why Stephen wants us to put money in the jar every time we say essential, because in the modern world, we call everything essential. Anything anybody cares about, they say is essential. Essential now just doesn't mean it's essence or character at all. It just means whatever I feel is important here. So it's become a redundant word. And this is that thing that we've talked about, that Kenneth talks about how each epoch paves over the language of the earlier epoch and makes it hard to talk about the things that represent the value system and worldview of the old epoch. So essentialism, where it's specifically about ethos, about character, what what is your nature internally that makes you become who you become and do the things that you do? To the Greeks, this is what it means to see the world as made up of organisms and not of things. If things are things, then they just are what they are and they're not what they're not, and there's nothing to understand. You can divide water into two cups of water and they're pretty much the same. It doesn't matter. But in a person or in a a cedar tree, the what they essentially are does matter and is more important than what the externals are. As Heraclitus says, nature loves to hide. There is the nature inside that's hidden, and that's where all the surprises come from. So what the Greeks did, where we get these character types, when we talk about Aristoi and modernity, Ari, as you asked us to talk about characterological genocide, that's what we're going to do for the next few weeks as an intermission in our Millennium Microcosm. Uh, so uh, so how do the Greeks get to this concept of the three character types? They get to them from the idea that everything is an organism, and all organisms have two natures, the nature around them and the nature within them, which have to be harmonized. The nature within you has to drive you into behaviors and the pursuit of certain excellences and desires, things you notice and don't notice, things you care about and don't care about, that weave you into the nature around you in a harmonious way, not a way without conflict. The Greeks loved conflict, but in a way that ensures that as you strive and struggle to be true to your nature, not only do you survive, not only does your species survive, but the larger ecosystem, the larger nature around you, it also thrives and survives thanks to your efforts. Last night, Beverly and I've been watching the David Attenborough series Planet Earth. I don't know how many people here have seen that, but man, I like that thing. We just watched an episode of Planet Earth 3 where it was talking about how depleted the fish stocks are in the modern world. It was talking about herring specifically. And then it talked about how these humpback whales would go in there and their behavior changed because of there isn't enough plankton around. And now they're gobbling up herring. And and Attenborough says, now you would think and of the subtext that he doesn't say, but that Kenneth would say is, as moderns, we think in zero-sum terms. So you would think that if these humpback whales are now gobbling up herring, then the herring stocks would go down. But instead they're going up. And that doesn't seem to make sense. Why would that happen? He says you have to understand the feedback loops in the ecosystem. Nature is more sophisticated than that. Whale poop has lots of iron in it. Iron is the necessary nutrient for plankton. Plankton is what herring feed on. So as the whales eat herring and poop, the poop causes blooms of the plankton, and the plankton cause even more herring to be there than there were before. So instead of adding more whales leading to a subtraction of the number of herring, adding more whales is leading to a multiplication of the number of herring. Herring stocks are rebounding wherever humpback whales are in there feeding on them. It's the damnedest thing. But that's what happens with feedback loops, right? So when the nature within you and the nature around you relate to each other in such a way that your behavior makes you weave yourself into the larger whole, not only do you thrive, but the larger whole thrives. This is sophrosune, this thing that most species have. And you see it with the humpback whales. It is doing the right thing. This weird thing that it's doing that would seem to be terrible is in fact the right thing to do to rebuild the stocks. And he was estimating, it's like if the phytoplankton also suck carbon out of the atmosphere. It turns out not only did they generate oxygen, they suck carbon out of the atmosphere. And he said, if whale populations, now that we've got legal protections for them, if they rebound to the levels they were before we started all the big whaling harvests of the 18th and 19th centuries, says the effect on the phytoplankton will cause an effect on the global carbon that is equivalent to planting 80 billion trees. That's the consequence of letting the humpback whales feed on the depleted herring stocks. This is sophrosune, right? The larger nature really does benefit from the whale doing its own competitive, vitalistic, naturalistic drive thing based on its ethos or its character. What Stephen was talking about. The whale acts according to its own initiative, but because it has a healthy set of instincts and a relationship to the habitat strengthens as the whale strengthens. This is what Nietzsche is talking about. This is what we lack as moderns. And we'll come to this. All of this kind of thinking, it might be surprising to somebody who's trying to understand the world through spreadsheets, but it's not surprising at all to the ancient Greeks. This is what sophrosune is. This is how inner nature relates to outer nature in a healthy ecosystem. And they get all that. They understand this. They're trying to deliberately engineer societies. And now we're going to come back after I call engineer. We're going to circle back to something that Stephen said earlier. It's not that I was against what Stephen was saying in general. He's just we're losing the thread, and I'm going to put the thread back together and weave him into it. Geneva, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, well, following Stephen's Jurassic Park example, there is an example in Jurassic Park. I think it's the second one where they go to a separate island and the dinosaurs and all of the animals are thriving. And they don't understand why, because they said they'd injected them or uninjected them with something that they would die within 7 days. But instead, they're thriving. So
Yeah.
they send a team in to find out what happened. And it's sort of like what you're describing with
Yes.
the whales. Like the smaller animals eat the, I don't know, the garbanzo beans or something, and then the larger animals eat the smaller animals with the substance in them, and so everybody's sort of thriving. That's
Yes.
what that reminded me of when you talked about the whale and the plankton and the herrings.
Yes.
So it's like nature has this thing all figured out if we just get out of the way, I think. Um,
Lysine
but
deficiency. Lysine deficiency. Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
that's what it was, lysine
Exactly.
deficiency. Yeah, I thought that was really cool. Yeah,
Yeah, me too. And it's not really fantasy at all. I mean, it is that's exactly how evolution works. The ones who don't have the drive to feed on the beans, the predators who don't have the drive to feed on those particular herbivores, yeah, they'll die out. But the freaks on the edge, who for whatever reason, nature creates diversity for this very reason. The freaks on the edge who are obsessed with the beans or obsessed with the herbivores who eat the beans, all of a sudden they're thriving, and now you've got another ecosystem running again. It's fascinating how this works, and it has to do with a lot of modernity is built out of the illusion that 1 + 1 = 2 sums everything up nicely. But the problem with 1 + 1 = 2 is that's a single pass. Ask a programmer about looping or about recursion. I mean, what you can do in a single pass is child's play compared to what's possible if you stick that thing in a loop and make it happen over and over and over. 1 + 1 is 2, but if you add one forever, you get infinity. I mean, you're at an entirely different scale of organization. You can do amazingly complex things just by putting things into kind of iterative, repetitive, recursive you create feedback loops when you start to get repetition and iteration at these kinds of levels. And nature just, with its generations, it's constantly doing that. And for the Greeks, who were closer to nature than we are, who were less insulated from nature than we are, for whom nature was the source of all sacred things and all life and everything else, these are just the obvious basic frames in which you understand politics or economics or culture or anything else. So so the Greeks are saying, we see that these animals have this superpower, this sophrosune, that allows them seemingly just acting. If a human being were to do the equivalent thing, we'd say that the animal's being more or less selfish. It's doing what it wants. It has no moral quality. A lot of philosophers talk about this. Animals don't seem to have any moral quality. That is, there is never any extent to which they're having to say, I want to do this, but I feel like it's wrong. I've been taught that it's wrong, and I'm going to try to suppress my instincts. As Stephen will tell you, Nietzsche has a lot of things to say about the human society trying to stomp down our instincts. He's like, all these animals, it's specifically through their instincts that they thrive and that they make the ecosystem thrive. Why are we the ones who are trying to kill our instincts at all the time? And when all that does is it causes us to be stunted and frustrated and not motivated, right? We get depressed. We're not doing anything that our inner drive wants us to do, and we get depressed and we're not able to live a life to its fullest. So the Greeks, on the one hand, saw that. And then on the other hand, they looked at human society and said, good heavens, there's something wrong with this species because we botch things left and right. It's almost like we don't even have sophrosune. What do we have? They became students of the inner nature of Homo sapiens. What is the nature of the ethos inside man? Just like they wanted to understand, why does the salmon return to its stream? Why does the acorn grow into an oak? They wanted to figure out, what is it that nature has constructed people to want to become? And how can we organize a society such that people are given the opportunity to try to become those things? And what they discovered is something very contra-modern. And this is where we're getting into the issue of Aristoi and modernity. The contra-modern thing that they discovered is there isn't a single human nature. There are at least three. And even those three are less a coherent nature than they are sort of like a little framework from which an enormous variety of possible natures can be constructed through culture and education and upbringing. That rather than being one culture for Homo sapiens, there's seemingly a vast number of potential cultures, depending on how people are raised, what habitat. I mean, the culture of I use the Sami example a lot. The culture of the reindeer herding Sami is quite different from the culture of the fishing Sami who live on the coast, of Scandinavia. Their lives are quite different, even though they're both Sami people. And the Sami have a strong sense of identity as Sami. They know they're a culture, except actually they're two different cultures. And each of them has a lot of jargon that only makes sense to them and not to the other. And each of them has to live their life and develop excellences. The things that they compete to be great at amongst themselves are different in these two different Sami groups. I mean, the reindeer herders have reindeer races, among other things. Who can really work the sledges? Who can really build the relationship with their reindeer? Who knows how to keep them healthy and cared for so that they're in the prime of health so that they can win the race? Meanwhile, here's the fisherman Sami, and they're out racing boats. They couldn't raise a reindeer. They'd have to, be raised to do that. They don't know how. But man, they can tie a knot and they can hit the wind at the right angle and they can fly over the waters. And there's a whole collection of behaviors and interests, things that you're aware of, things that you notice, things that you care about that are different among these two people, even though they both identify as Sami and technically speak, very close languages. This is what the Greeks noticed about us. We're like we're like a we're like a I don't know how to say it. If you think of most animal species as having one culture that goes with the biology, so that the kind of animal can be thought of not just as a set of genes or a body, but can be thought of as a culture. If you look at Homo sapiens, we're one biological culture that's designed to create hundreds of different. Sorry, we're one biological species that has the capacity to create hundreds of cultural species. And that's not something we've seen in animals before. And that creates very weird and interesting difficulties for constructing human societies. Geneva, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Um, what you're describing makes me wonder about uh, the the thing that we think about, nature versus nurture, in human beings. Like two people born in the same family, raised by the same parents, following the same rules and regulations, and they come out completely different. Um, but that must be character, do you think? Or is it a nature versus nurture thing? I mean, Zola wrote 20 novels trying to figure this out. He never did, but makes one wonder. Maybe it's not nurture, or maybe it's nature then, because of character, ethos, or um, I don't know. Maybe nurture has nothing to do with it, or I don't know. It's a mixed bowl, I guess.
Yeah,
It's
these are
making me wonder.
extraordinarily complicated questions. And it's a place where in modern science we're sort of obsessed right now with the mechanics of genetics. We like the idea that maybe it's all programmable, but ironically, that's happening at the same time that in psychology we're coming to understand that who you grow up to become is a mix of nature and nurture. In the mid 20th century, they had the tabula rasa model, and they said anybody can become anything. You just have to educate them properly, and that led to some really awful really awful educational plans in which everybody tried to be beat into the same shapes. And as Kenneth said, he had several children, and no two of them grew up the same way, even though they had the same parents. And it taught him more than he ever had learned any other way about human nature. That idea that inside each person is a distinct ethos. However it got there, there's a distinct ethos, and that the person has, and now we're back to Stephen and Nietzsche, the person has the drive to express what's inside them, to become. It's like the Greeks say, we only become what we already are, which is an oversimplification, but it gets the general idea that, you know, through all our changing circumstances, the oak sapling is still trying to reach toward the light. And if other trees fall down and change where the light is or grow up and shade that may change where it reaches, but it's still reaching towards the light, even though the light's in a different place now. So there's this way in which you can explain through this kind of interaction between what you're driven to do and the various what stays the same and what changes in nature around you. In the tug of war, the shifting tug of war between those things, you can account for why every oak tree is an oak tree and yet no two oak trees are identical. They each had different circumstances, shifting circumstances around them that caused them to express their inner oakiness in the way that was right for that moment and that time and place and what was happening right there. So in people, it's trickier because we are a more cultural animal than other animals are. I mean, it could be that there are other animals where it's not one to one, cultural species to biological species. I mean, a culture allows for a certain amount of variation, but still, it could be that they're all one to one. It could be that there's some that aren't. We're not sure. This whole concept of a cultural species doesn't exist in biology. It's there. There's nothing like it. We're sort of gradually piecing together behavior and how you fit into ecosystems and stuff like that. And none of it has brought us to the realization yet that for every biological species, there's at least one cultural species that goes with it. The Greeks, this is easy stuff for them. Zoe, bios, ethos, they've got all the terms they need. They have all the concepts to see the linkage between the animal and what it wants to be excellent at, what it's driven to do by its character, and how that fits into a way of life that fits into an ecosystem. That's the Greeks have all the terminology. We really don't. And for us, all that character culture stuff is so much subjectivity, and we sort of have sciences about those things, and then we sort of don't have sciences, and those sciences are constantly trying to reduce things down to maybe I can just give you a drug and change your behavior. There must be some simple button I can push. We want it to be a machine. And so as long as we keep thinking that way, we're going to have a hard time recognizing what the Greeks saw about us, which is that this one to many problem, the one biological species with the many cultural species that we could potentially grow into, is the fundamental challenge of Homo sapiens. How does the course of that development play out? Do we become, a Socrates, or do we become a Pol Pot? What do we grow into, and why do we do it? The Greeks said this is the most important question that Homo sapiens faces. There's nothing more important than this. Aristotle says we've come to a stage in our development where, yeah, I mean, there can be volcanoes from time to time, yeah, tornadoes, whatever. But most of the time, most of the problems, most of the big, not just the little problems, most of the big, serious civilization ending problems that we face are us. It's us. That question of the variability, what are we going to grow into or not grow into? This is the ball game. And this is why everything depends on the education of the young, paideia, anthropoculture. It's largely about this. But they didn't make the mistake of thinking that there is a tabula rasa. They didn't think that you can infinitely mold or shape people into whatever you want them to be, because they made a discovery. And they made the discovery backwards. We've talked about this before, but let's be clear about it now. That they started their philosophical inquiry after they already had a political economy in place and enormous amounts invested in keeping it going. The people in charge were not going to be willing to say, "Oh, why don't I step down and let that slave be in charge just because he's got the right character?" No, that's not what they weren't really looking to create an ideal society. They were looking to justify the inequalities that they inherited. Why am I in charge? I must be a really cool person. Those people, why are they my slaves? They must suck in some way. How could I think about what's sucky about them and what's awesome about me? This is how it all begins, right? Why am I sitting up here on this cushy throne and I'm resting my feet on you? Why? Why is that happening? So it starts out as cheap rationalization. Because the truth is, the reason I conquered them is, I attacked their ancestors with swords while they were asleep in the night, and I beat them all. I'm more murderous and violent and aggressive than they are, and they couldn't believe that people would come in and do that, and now they're all slaves, and now I run everything, and they do all the work, and I get all the goodies, and that's how a lot of the conquest of Europe. That's how a lot of it began, but that only satisfies the conquerors. You get the kids and then the grandkids and the great grandkids. And at some point, somebody asks the question, why? I like that slave. I grew up with that slave. So that slave to me is like my friend. Actually, I like him more than I like you, even though you're in charge. Why are you in charge and he's a slave? That people start asking these questions, and the ruling class gets uncomfortable. And to make sure they can raise their kids to be the new ruling class, they have to come up with increasingly plausible justifications. And the most plausible justification you can come up with is something real. And so over 1,000 or more years, the ancestors of the Greeks and the Greeks themselves put together a philosophical anthropology in which they worked out different kinds of human character. What is despicable in human character? What is admirable in human character? What's the best? What's the worst? And in the same way that they would say, man, that hawk is the most amazing, effective hunting hawk ever, right? Whereas your hawk that you've got on your arm, man, it's a dud. You pretty much just have to feed it. It doesn't want to fly anywhere. And they'd say, what is the essence of hawkiness? What makes hawks, ultimately hawky? And they started doing that with people, and they gradually worked out that initially they worked out two different character types, right? Originally, it was the douloi versus the Aristoi. And the douloi were the slaves. And so you can find a lot of ancient Greek writing about slavishness, not people who happen to have been captured and turned into slaves. They had different words for that. You're minding your own business, wandering down the road, and some asshole comes along and jumps you and puts you in shackles. And that the word that they would use for you is not the word doulos. They had a different word that meant some unfortunate who has been made a slave of. Doulos means people who have the character of a slave. And they would apply it even to people in the ruling class. What a doulos that guy is. Yeah, he has his own estate. And yeah, they work for him and he has some political influence. But the man has the mind and character of a slave. So they're creating at that point a separation between the role versus the character. They were recognizing and it culminates in Aristotle with his withering critiques of ancient Greek politics, where he says, this is what a genuine democracy would be like. This is a genuine monarchy. This is a genuine aristocracy. And this, by the way, is what it looks like when it's fake. Here's a tyranny. Here's an oligarchy, and so on, a mobocracy. And he left it to his audience to look around and go, huh, the governments we have look a lot more like the bad forms than like the good forms. He didn't spell it out, so moderns miss it. But he's talking about this issue. There is a separation that's being recognized between the character type and the political role. And when that separation begins to happen, that's when you have developed Greek philosophical anthropology. So they're recognizing there is a real thing here, regardless of how you're treated. You might have as a slave somebody who could be the best person to govern you. Your system may have screwed up and put shackles on an Aristos. And woe to all of you for having done that, because you might be going to face a crisis that's the only guy in the world who's going to be able to figure out how to get out of the crisis. But no, you've got him digging ditches, so we're all going to go down. The Greeks were very interested. Why do some civilizations thrive and others fail? And they were very self-critical about it, including about their own ancestral heroes. That's why they taught the Iliad and the Odyssey the way they did. How have we botched things to have created the Dark Age that we're now clawing our way out of? The Greeks really wanted to know the answer. How do we get out of this morass? And how do we not go right back into it again? as the inheritors of a self-inflicted thing. So they start by separating the concept of the Aristos from the doulos. And the initial separation is as follows. The Aristos, by definition, is whatever is in Homo sapiens that most exemplifies our arete, the things that are distinctively human, that a cheetah can't do, that an oak can't do, that a salmon can't do. What is this? What is it that Homo sapiens at its best can do? And that they call the Aristoi, right? They exemplify our arete, our I should put arete, the plural. They exemplify our arete, which is what are our distinctive excellences that allow us to live the life in which Homo sapiens thrives and the ecosystem thrives. And the douloi were described as those who lack those arete, and the Aristoi were those who have those arete in the most abundance. So at this point, we're talking a very primitive binary, right, philosophical anthropology. But they began to notice that there was a third caste, and they were a little slow on the uptake. If they'd figured it out sooner, maybe there wouldn't have been the Peloponnesian War, but they didn't figure it out in time. The Peloponnesian War really helped cement it, but they were starting to see it before then. They saw it with the emergence of the sophists during the time of Socrates and Plato. And they really saw it when Athens self-destructed during the Peloponnesian War. And this third caste is the Banausoi. So we end up with douloi versus Banausoi versus Aristoi. And what they began to realize is at first they thought it had to do with control of your appetites and emotionalism. They said the douloi lack all control. They're slaves of their appetites. They're slave of their emotionalism, of their parochialism, their experiences. And they at first thought that Aristoi is anybody who has overcome that. And you can find a lot. I mean, in ancient Greek writing, you can find a lot of distinction between these two categories. And it took them a while to figure out that there are plenty of people who apparently have separated themselves or distanced themselves, or as Hegel says, have negated their emotionalism, their instinctualism, their parochialism, their appetivism, and yet don't seem to have any real understanding of deeper values or principles. And the Greeks were going, what is that? What are we seeing there? And of course, the answer was what they were seeing was what was causing the fall of their civilization, right? When the merchant class in Athens said, it's not enough to beat the Spartans, we also want to conquer the Western Mediterranean and control all the trade because we're going to be so rich if we control all. It's not enough to have the Eastern Mediterranean. We want the Western Mediterranean. So while we're fighting Sparta, let's also open up a giant war front to the west and invade Sicily. Let's go attack Syracuse. And of course, it leads to the devastation of everything because the Banausoi have no sense. They have their ideologies, they have their systems of thinking, they have their spreadsheets that tell them that there's a lot of money at stake, but they don't understand what makes civilizations rise and fall. They don't understand the limits and liabilities of human character, especially their own. So they're self-blind and they can't see their own defects. They're like an alcoholic who doesn't know he's an alcoholic. An alcoholic who knows he's an alcoholic can do something about it. But someone who's in denial about it is going to just run off the rails and go into crisis. And that's what Banausoi always do. They don't know their limits and liabilities. And if they're in charge, they'll lead the entire civilization into crisis. And this is what the Greeks are figuring out about the time that their civilization is collapsing around them. And they never recover from the Peloponnesian War. I mean, Sparta wins, Athens loses, but the Athenians, when the Spartans are in charge, they piss off a bunch of the other Greeks, and then you end up with another war against another city-state, and Sparta loses that one. The other city-state wins. They piss off everybody. You end up with another. It's just civil war after civil war after civil war until Philip of Macedonia comes in and kicks their asses and takes over. And now the Greeks are over. We're now in a new age, the Hellenistic age. So one of the things Kenneth says is the Greeks discovered all three character types, but they discovered the Banausoi too late. Too late to do anything about it. I mean, by the time they figured out it was a problem, the Banausoi in Athens had all been given the vote by the new constitution under Solon, so they could outvote the Aristoi. They could use propaganda and populism to rile up people to get them on their side and then lead them into catastrophe. And there was just no way back from that. So this paper that I've uploaded, which I will share with Geneva. I did share it with you. I'll share it with Ari in a second, and I'll share it with Joe. This is where Kenneth Smith initially describes these three basic character types: who are the douloi, who are the banausoi, and who are the aristoi. And all of it comes from the Greeks just trying to play out this thing of, if we want to understand human nature, we have to look at the ethos. We have to separate what's essential from what's inessential and figure out what's at the core of Homo sapiens. And they say what we have found at the core is not one thing, but three things. And that's a surprise. And now we got to figure out what to do about that. All right, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Great, thanks. Want to make sure, can you guys hear me? Okay, good. I wanted to share a couple ideas. Stephen can push back on these. They're kind of modeling ideas. I get it. They're models, so they're not perfect, but it goes something like this, that the douloi, the banausoi, and the aristoi seem to me also represent something close to what we have in modern times, which is a little bit like this avoidant or an anxious, which doesn't really sound like the same at all. But in a neuroscience, avoidant and anxious attachment styles are actually claims on attention. So an avoidant person, usually when they want to avoid something, they're not attending it as much. They're attending it less or not at all. And when you do that, you reduce your attention to that, especially if it's a human, to something that's more like an object. Instead, essentially, you move from an I-thou attention style closer towards an I-it attention style. And this I-it attention style focuses on something that's present and surface level, thin. This is what we would call in system thinking a stock. What's the stock? How big is the stock, right? So these people are generally interested in success, wealth, and the status, but not the things that are underneath that drive it. And in that language, in system thinking, that's called flow. And it's interesting that it would seem like the douloi, the people who are just interested in feeling all the time, or I also go a little further, we'll just save this for later, bracket it for later, is this idea that Hannah Arendt talks about when a people becomes a mass, that essentially that they're a part of a movement. And a movement is just wherever it goes. It always needs to be on the move. And essentially this is a flow. And this is about, like, think about food. I don't care how much food there actually is. I just need to keep eating. I'm just eating right now and I'm all about eating. So that very much sounds like the person who's very much in their feelings and just like what I feel right now, just feeling. And it's interesting in that state, the opposite thing happens for this instead of under attending to something where like it's just an object and it doesn't matter so much, you over attend to it and you actually attribute extra personhood to it. This is where things like codependence come from, where you don't have like a sense of self without this. And so you latch onto this other thing as it's where you get your sense of personhood from. And specifically what I'm claiming is when you under attend, things tend to be more like an I-it attention style. And when you over attend, objects seem to take on more personhood, or things that have personhood have godlike personhood, worship, right? And so it's interesting that if you make this claim in the douloi, the banausoi, as having have a problem with stocks and flows, you would say that Aristoi is healthily managing surface level stocks and governing underlying flows. They're able to see the exterior and the interior and have a healthy balance between what's really going on. Essentially, they're able to match their model with what is actually happening in reality, and they adjust their model when reality changes. And essentially the douloi or the banausoi is stuck in this, I'm just going to look at the stock. I just need to win at all costs. I need to be king. I need to have the money, but doesn't really look at the underneath of what's the flow. And the other version of this is just being stuck in the flow where you don't care what the stock is. You just need to feel it all the time. And I just felt like it's so interesting that these types of descriptions as models are all incomplete, but they're all speaking to a similar sort of extra level, like super level. What I'm saying is terribly complex, infinite life, right? It's too complex for us to actually model. Like that's what models are. They use proxies variables to sort of describe things. We don't have access to reality in the actual way. So we use these proxies for the modeling. And I just found this really interesting that you can see these dynamics and they're speaking to it. And I find that it's not even a disagreement or an argument. It's just like a translation exercise. They're trying to capture the same thing. And it's just humans are like this. Anyways, maybe that's too reductive myself. I don't want to be in that reductive state, but it's just an interesting thought I'd like to share.
Thank you for sharing it. And what it underscores is that the Greeks are really onto something here, because you can come at this from many different angles using many different sciences, and you keep coming across these same divisions. Now, in the modern world, we say that well, and we'll come to this, the moderns don't believe Aristoi exists at all. We think there's only emotionalism versus intellectualism, and that's all there is. And that emotionalism, i.e., irrationalism, is the source of all evil, and rationalism, we think, is the source of all good things. And if we could just make society orderly enough, with enough laws and enough cops and enough guns, then until everybody only does what the law tells them to do in excruciating detail, we will achieve utopia. The rationalism leads to all good things. And this is what happens when, as described in this paper, this human natures paper that I shared, this is what it means when Kenneth says the modern world is the world that Banausoi create for Banausoi, to be run by Banausoi. It exemplifies the Banausic worldview and legislates it. And what it does is it legislates out of existence any role for Aristoi, because Banausoi don't believe in Aristoi. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Let's see. Well, this was a point Schiller was making. It's a question of egoism. You had egotism being referred to by Joseph Addison, coined the term egotist in 1714 in reference to the increasing use of the word I in everyday language. So we notice a large number of references today, me, myself, and I. Now, at the end of the 18th century, we've got Schiller, who teaches us not egotism, but egoism, the transcendental ego, the ideal self. But he said there's a flaw in that sort of thinking, that today, especially, you go to school and it's full of teachers and they're always talking about the ideal self, being this God that's floating above reality. This is something that wasn't in the mass of humanity, say, back in the Middle Ages. This is something modern. And you said we're not observing what's actually going on around us. In egoism is where the ego withdraws into its inner mental space. Egotism is more that you want everybody else to notice you. And so with this egoism, we've withdrawn into a set of ideals or rational principles, and we're looking down upon all the drives. The person, we were saying that's the lower self. I'm above that. I'm floating above it. And yes, he's making this warning that we're not noticing the role of what was called the lower self. We're imagining where this higher self floating all above the lower self, but it's actually not working out because we're still dominated by the lower self. We've just shot the messenger. We're not noticing what's going on. We think we're serving higher rational principles, but secretly working away, the lower self has made its way back in. Only this time you're not noticing what's going on.
Yes. Yes. I mean, Goethe's a massive influence on the existentialist tradition. And the things that you're talking about and via Schiller are this is all underpinning everything that we're going to be talking about during this intermission. I'm glad you brought it up.
Well, in his plays, he'd have the modern. He develops plays, and this egoism and egotism is so part of the new common personality. Every man and his dog have decided, I want a giant palace in the suburbs with 5 cars as good as Elvis in their garage, and this projection of I'll only find myself true self when I've risen to my ideal. And I mean, of course, in the Middle Ages, the peasants, their ideal was to have a full meal at the end of the day. But today we've got that. We want more.
Yes. There's that song. I don't know if you remember the movie from the early 80s, Fame, about the Juilliard School and the people who
I
go.
want to live forever.
And that theme song, yes, me. I want to learn how to fly and live forever.
The me generation.
And these are superhuman desires. It's the ego wanting to be a god. Everyone should look at me. Everyone should think about me. I'm the center of focus. But what if 4 billion people back then are all saying, no, no, it has to be me. No, not you. Me. I. It's core to modernity that we don't think about the impossibility of that actually working as a system. We don't critique it. We say, well, yes, live. This is what all the Disney films are about. Live your dream. Whatever your hopes and dreams are, you can embody them. You can bring them to life. All those protagonists who are, I may be poor, but I'm plucky, and I'm gonna, next thing you know, I will be the one who marries the princess. You know,
Well, egoism, another manifestation of it is the belief that you're special. Flying saucer comes down, you're sitting in the park, and the alien comes out, and you say to the alien, "Well, I'm the special human living on planet Earth." All right, so I found the one special human amongst the 8 billion.
yeah.
I've bagged it already. I thought I was going to have to hunt around.
One anal probe coming right up. Thanks for volunteering. Yes. We don't want to think about the consequences, right? Of what if you are the one in charge? Who's gonna make the spectacular blunder? Well, I guess it's gonna be me. Yay! Everyone will blame me for everything that goes wrong, and they'll be
Well, the idea that, a lot of people get the idea that somehow they're special.
yes.
They're beyond all the others, because if you step out of yourself, look around, there's about 8 billion people, and a lot of them think they're special.
Well, it's a particular kind of specialness, isn't it? It's the all special, omni special. I'm special in all ways. Whereas, if you think of, I know Sharon's not here today, but if you think about a medical community, it's true that there are a lot of special people, but each of them is only special in their own particular way. I mean, I want Sharon as my anesthesiologist. I know some great surgeons, and I don't want any of them doing anesthesia on me. I know some great pharmacists. I don't want them doing anesthesia on me either. Only the anesthesia expert is special, but what they're special about is anesthesia specifically. So this idea of a multidimensional world in which there are many different angles in which somebody can be special, it's missing from this weird abstract omni-specialness that our ego aspires to. I want to be special in all ways. I want to be the one king, the one everybody should look up to me. It's like, as opposed to, I want to be part of a really interesting community full of a lot of weirdos who are good at different things, and I want to be one of those weirdos who's good at my weird little thing. That is also a kind of special, but it's a much less egotistical special and more of a, as you're saying, egoistical special. You're withdrawing from all of the other forms of specialness to just what is, maybe it's butterflies and plants and in Seattle, and that's going to be my thing. I don't really want to be famous for anything else or in any other group. But for modernity, that notion of limits to the ego is really hard to grasp because we're all taught to be all inflating and just grow, grow, grow. Anyway, also,
Self-esteem. I'm the one special person. If I understand that I'm special,
yes,
I will grow.
that's right. I liked also your post in the chat. For those following on the video who might not be seeing the chat, he put a quote in here about the three reverences. To prevent egoism from going astray, Goethe advocated for cultivating reverence for what is above us, the divine, what is around us, our peers, and what is below us, nature or suffering. Notice nature, God, and man are right here in this Goethe formulation of things that we should hold in reverence. One of the things that Kenneth Smith talks about, and some of the people that he quotes, is that part of what defines Banausoi is that they're incapable of reverence of any kind because they can't imagine anything better than their ideology or their calculation or their money or whatever the number is that they use to measure themselves. Maybe it's their IQ. Yeah, I'll do that, Joe. So This is what Stephen posted up above. This Goethe quote. So that part of what defines Aristoi is that they understand that there are things that need to be sacred. And to a Benausos, that's an offensive idea. The Benausoi don't not only don't the Benausoi believe in anything sacred, but if something is sacred, then that imposes some sort of obligation or limit on their ego, and they can't handle it. Right? They want to go wherever their ideology points them. They want to do whatever their spreadsheets tell them to do. They imagine an infinite extent of ego with no blockages. And this is why part of the ethos of the Benausos, that they'll talk a lot about freedom, by which they mean freedom of my ego to do everything and to be everything and to swell and expand and to be omnispecial in the way that Stephen was talking about. This is core to what it is to be a Benausos. After all, you can always add one more and get a bigger number. There shouldn't be any point at which the math breaks down. But in a real ecosystem, there are limits, lots of limits, right? Just because you can drink water doesn't mean you can drink poison. I mean, you can drink it once, as they say about mushrooms. All mushrooms are edible. Some are only edible once. This is the thing about an Aristos, is that an Aristos recognizes that there are limits. There need to be limits on our appetites. There need to be limits on the extent to which we can be true to our feelings, and there need to be limits on our ideologies and calculations, because none of those things is as important as the vitality of the individual and the species and the ecosystem as a whole. This is where we get back to Nietzsche. Vitalism. For Nietzsche, life, how much life and being alive and liveliness and being alive to the world around you and within you, that's the sign of success for Nietzsche. And he's in formulating it that way, he's trying to restate the ancient Greek eristic ethos. And to be true to life, you have to focus on what matters to life. You have to put limits up and say, there are many things that you can do, but there are certain things you can't mess with. You will not pollute the air or we can't breathe. You will not pollute the water or we can't drink. There are things that have to be protected or there's no life. It doesn't matter if you win the game and we all die. To the Aristos, that's obvious. To the Benausos, that's offensive. The game is all there is. They don't believe in things above. When Stephen talks about, how much does modernity make sense in the early years, the early centuries, when it's riding the back of the medieval value system and worldview in which there's a God. Modernity in which there's still a God is a different kind of modernity from the modernity that gets full of itself and discards God, as Nietzsche accuses it of doing, and starts saying, not even God can limit us. Only our spreadsheets and ideologies will determine what we do. At that point, as Stephen and Nietzsche point out, modernity has metastasized into something that no longer believes anything is sacred. And by not believing anything is sacred, that includes the preconditions for its own survival. Even they're not sacred. And thus modernity sets it up as a system that will destroy itself. All of this is part of this ancient Greek philosophical anthropology. When they say that only the Aristoi should govern, right? Going back to the history, they're saying two different things. The first is, we are the Aristoi, not in the terms that we have the character, but we're the political, social, economic class of Aristoi. We are in charge. We are the only ones who can govern. This is the law, and now we have to retroactively rationalize it. So on the one hand, unconsciously, they continue to mean that. But on the other, as they come up with the most convincing rationalization and justification for it possible, they invent their philosophical anthropology. And in that philosophical anthropology, they ask the question, what kind of character would make someone fit to govern? And what kind of character would make someone unfit to govern? And then they define their three ethoi based on that. And by the time they're done with their definitions, you look at it and you say, well, yeah, there's no way I'd want a doulos governing me. He'd constantly be lying, he'd relentlessly be lining his own pockets, he'd be sleeping with all the pretty women, he'd be punching in the face anyone he doesn't like. He's acting out his appetites. And when he's depressed, The entire national economy gets depressed. And when he's, bipolar hypermanic, all of a sudden everything in the economy it's unreliable. You don't have a decent foundation for civilization. That this is something that Kenneth talks about, right? The problem with Duloi is by being prisoners of their own emotions and feelings, they hold the entire world hostage to their shifting, changing emotions and feelings. You can't have a permanent marriage from somebody who thinks only while they're feeling the exalted form of love is the marriage healthy. And the first time they get angry at the person, they go, oh, well, I guess it's over because I don't feel good anymore. Marriage is supposed to make me feel good. And since it isn't, it must be done. These are marriages that can't last, right? And it's the same with civilizations. The Banausoi have a different problem in that they're creating these cool, instead of hot systems that are just all over the place, they're creating these cool crystalline mathematical systems that tend towards the totalitarian, right? The numbers will rule everything. Everybody has to march in lockstep, no exceptions. One law for everybody. We're all equal, whether we are or not. And in that modern insistence that we're all equal, what they're saying is Martin Luther King Jr. is absolutely no better than Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy. They're equal. There's an equal sign between them. They're the same. And Martin Luther King Jr. doesn't believe that, right? He said we should be judging each other by the content of our character. He said a Greek thing, a contra-modern thing. So, Banausoi, you can't let them be in charge because to them nothing is sacred. And they will trample the preconditions for civilization. The preconditions for everything that you love, they'll trample them if their equation tells them to, if their ideology tells them to. The purpose of the sacred is to create a safe space for the things we cannot do without, the things that we must reverence, to use Goethe's term that Stephen shared with us. Some things, like when the Lakota say water is life, they're not kidding, right? Without clean water, it doesn't really matter what else we have. You can only go 3 days without clean water. And after that, it's sickness or death. Only the Aristoi, by definition, the eristic character is the one that cares about those invisible things without which we can't survive. It's what it means to be eristic. So if you look at this paper that I shared with you, you will see discussion. I mean, the abstract, he does some brief introduction. I'm going to go ahead and walk us through parts of this. My goal for today is to get us really well grounded on what are the Duloi, Banausoi, and Aristoi. And then next time, maybe next week, we could talk about what is it about modernity that would cause it to necessarily conduct characterological genocide against the Aristoi. So in doing this, it'll give us some background for understanding millennium microcosm as well, because each epoch of these three in Europe is dominated by a different caste. And if you think of these character types as castes. So let's look at this. I'm going to take us through the abstract, and then we'll dip into various pieces of the paper. But feel free to read the paper on your own another time. Yeah, here we go. Here's the first bit, right? The opening paragraph. He writes, under Christian and scientific culture, human nature, quote unquote, has come to suggest facile abstractions of presumptuous universality. Presumptuous universality. The Greeks were far more astute observers of cultures and nature and of their synthesis in character, that is, ethos. The Greeks understood that, quote, the human could not have a univocal sense given the diversity of ways of thinking and living. This is what we talked about earlier today, the many cultures. And thus they defined the dominant character types, accounting for the modulations or equivocations in the ways of being human. Life is lived in a particular key, each type a specific mode of subjectivity biased by its natural limitations. With me so far, or I should say with Kenneth so far, this is how he starts our discussion. of what this means. And then he takes us next into the three types with a little capsule summary. So I'm going to take us to that capsule to we'll do each of those capsules and talk about them a little bit. And we'll get into them a little bit more during this call than I'm going to do right now. But just as a starting place, of the three keys, most primitive is the slavish personality or doulos, dominated by his psyche's raw materials, his needs, his appetites, his impulses. His life is morally or rationally passive, structureless, dissolute, and myopic. We're going to come back to all four of those terms in a moment. Left to itself, it chaotizes into worse pathos. In symbiosis with a master, the doulos can be contained within prudential forms, but still lacks inherent resources for self-control. So what's he talking about here? You know, there's this critical Greek concern about cosmos versus chaos. And as we said, you know, when we were doing chapter 4 of this book, Millennium Microcosm, for the Greeks, the cosmos was originally the term for the Greek fighting unit. And they understood that the reason that as they conquered the indigenous people of the Hellenic Peninsula, they understood that the reason that they won is that the societies they were fighting against, when they fought, they weren't able to synthesize a larger fighting unit. It was a bunch of individual heroes coming out trying to be heroes. And what the Greeks did is they subordinated the personalities of the warriors into the group, the fighting group, and they paid attention to each other. Who needs support? Who needs backup? Who needs someone to take the lead? And they tried to make a larger organism out of the many small organisms of individual fighters. And this is their concept of when we talk about that they see the world as made out of organisms, they recognize that an organism is made of other organisms. And that it itself is also a participant along with a bunch of peers in some larger meta-organism that it also constructs. And this is part of what's different between living tissue versus unliving tissue, right? We're made of cells, but we're not just made of cells. We're made of tissues that are made of cells. And we're made of organs that are made of tissues that are made of cells. And we're made of systems that are made of organs that are made of tissues that are made of cells, and on ad infinitum. And it goes on beyond the individual human level. We create families and neighborhoods and tribes and peoples, cultures. We create a species. And even the species works with other species within a larger ecosystem to establish, you know, a healthy growing harmony that makes a richer habitat so that there can be more people over time as long as we're living in harmony with the larger ecosystem. To the Greeks, this was all obvious, and it's all captured in the concept of a cosmos. A cosmos is what you have when a number of peer organisms working together are able to relate to each other in such a harmonic way that together they create a larger superorganism. And that superorganism is able to be effective because it is a cosmos among the smaller organisms. This isn't about law and order versus chaos. The modern way of expressing this is irrelevant to the Greek concept. When they say chaos, they don't mean the opposite of law and order. The chaos that they're talking about might be law and order. Law and order can be chaos to the ancient Greeks. The question is not whether you have law and order, but whether your organization forms a cosmos. And if it doesn't, then it doesn't matter how much law and order you have. It is a chaos. A chaos is what happens when individuals can't cohere into a larger superorganism. And they recognize that chaos means defeat. Chaos means we lose. Chaos means we are not fit to survive. We don't want to be the Greeks. The irony of the story of the Greeks is that in the end, they dissolved into civil wars, which was a form of chaos, which is why they were defeated by the, you know, backwoods hick hillbilly Macedonians, much to their shame. Because they knew the most important thing was to behave like a cosmos, and still they let themselves collapse into a chaos. And what happened is exactly what they thought would happen if they let that occur. To them, this is one of the most fundamental value systems they have. Don't be a chaos, be a cosmos. And when they look at the doulic personality, they see that douloi can't organize themselves together into anything but a chaos, because one of them's happy when another one's angry. One of them wants to have sex with the first one. The first one doesn't want to have sex with them and wants to have sex with somebody else. But no, he forgot about that. Now he's not attracted, and instead he's looking at butterflies. I mean, everything is just moment to moment. They have this is what he means by dissolute and myopic and structureless. He says there is no larger organizing principle that can pull them together into a cosmos. It's like herding cats, a bunch of individual things, each running their own way. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Like I'm off mute here. Okay. Well, I think you said so many wonderful things about Aristoi. I think, they're not all knowing, all powerful, whatever. And sometimes modernity, when discussing Greek Aristoi, tend to think, or they don't even all agree with each other. They have better arguments, more founded. I think it's significant that when Kenneth mentions them, he always mentions them in terms of the rigorous self-examination to themselves and to their thoughts and to whatever is being proposed. They think better, more rigorously. So I just don't want anybody listening to this to think that Kenneth is suggesting that, gosh, all these people agreed with each other and they were all right all the time. They never made a mistake.
Nope.
That's not what it is.
Not at all.
They do it, and you're quite right. Just not that you need my second, but the effect can be said kind of that the effect of Aristoi on a society is cosmic. That is, they are the only personality type capable of creating order. I mean, a healthy order.
Organic order.
An organic order, right. And that is something that the Douloi and the Nosoi can't do, because they cannot get past their own self-centeredness, the fact that, yes, order is me, 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 me. Okay, I think that's all I want to be clear here. We would still, if we were ruled today by Aristoi, there would still be public debate.
All the time.
All the time. The ruthless examination of all proposals would not just go on. Well, it doesn't go on today. What we can't call what we do examination, I think. But it would go on. There would be disagreement. There would be considerations of all the alternatives. They're likely. Oh, yeah, the future is still closed. That's a property of the future, not a property of Aristoi. Oh, they're dim-witted because they can't see the future. No, the future can't be seen.
Yes, not by mortals.
They got nothing to do with us. Got to do with its nature, not ours. Or maybe it does. It does our limited nature. It's a consequence. So yes, things would be, but many questions. There would be as many questions with them, just not as many stupid ones, perhaps, or something, or foolish ones. Yeah, like, what was I? Yeah, we wouldn't be sending Wyckoff and Kushner to negotiate the fate of our nation in war, or something like that. Things we do that are, in a sense, unimaginable. I don't want to get into politics here. It's just the kinds of choices that we make as to, we send wheeler dealers, which reflects the banausic nature of modernity.
Right.
And you think, oh yeah,
this is going to end well.
Yeah. Well, it's the kind of order. Yeah, that's kind of a way you can judge. It's the kind of order that gets created.
Yes.
And this would be the order of the deal.
Yeah.
Everything is just making a deal. There is never anything more at stake. Oh, they've
Yes,
been
they've
to
been to
business school.
Exactly.
Right. They avoided the philosophy department. Well, they should have avoided the philosophy department anyway, because
we'll be talking about that.
You won't find Kenneth in any philosophy departments anymore. So anyway, enough.
But the point is really important. It's like when you're a kid and you dream about being an amazing martial artist, you think I'm going to be a black belt. That must be the coolest. Then I would know everything. And of course, when you actually go through a traditional dojo, what you eventually discover is black belt is not the end, it's the beginning. Black belt is the point at which your sensei thinks you're finally able to really teach yourself things. You've gotten out of your own way enough that you've learned how to learn. And then now you get the black belt to say, now let's begin. Finally, we can have a conversation. And this is what it's like to be an Aristos. Is like you reach the level of maturity at which you think, every question we ask has its own rights. There's more going on here than my appetites and emotions on the one hand, and my ideologies and systems of thinking on the other. There's the thing itself has rights, and I have to care about those rights, even though it doesn't obviously or immediately or directly benefit me. It's like Duloy and Banalsoy are chasing two different kinds of happiness directly, and they don't understand that the best kind of enduring happiness is the one that comes from doing the things that generate a habitat in which happiness becomes possible. They're all like, no, I want to get it like, a treasure. I won the treasure. I got the princess. I'm now the prince. Give me the trophy. I get the medal. That when you're obsessed with the end itself as a deliverable, then you're not creating an organism that's capable of generating that end repeatedly. You're playing a zero-sum game. I have it, you don't. Ha ha. You know, rather, what are we saying? How do you divide, seven apples among four people? Well, a good start is to plant as many of those seeds as you can. And the math problem hides that dimension. Because if you plant a bunch, then next year we aren't going to have this problem because we won't have seven apples. We'll have 7,000 apples. So we'll plant all these apple trees. But you have to be able to think outside the limits of your system or your immediate appetites to see the potential for growth and, the deeper truths that are available. You have to think, as Donald put it, cosmically, right?
There's somewhere in Plato, someone asked Socrates. My memory gets faded, but about like internal and external relations.
Yes.
And Socrates says, well, do you see the difference between a face and a bucket of rocks? The face holds itself together as a whole, and the rocks are held together by the bucket. And it's not very elaborate, sophisticated, whatever example, but it's just, if you can remember some very simple things, you'll never get fooled by what's organic, what's external, what are internal relationships, because you can say, oh, is it like a face or is it like a bucket of rocks? Well,
Yes. Is it a cat or is it a toaster?
Right. It's exactly the same thing, only Socrates, the toasters in Athens weren't there yet.
There were buckets of rocks.
Yeah. But yeah, they had rocks. They had plenty of rocks.
I've been watching this YouTube series in which this woman at a historical recreation society back east is she cooks recipes from 18th century and 19th century French cookbooks. And she does it using the tools and the techniques. I mean, it's all cooked on the fireplace, and it's astonishing to see how people used to do this stuff. But but honestly, a bucket of rocks is in fact a toaster because you heat the rocks, and now you can put a pot on top, right? And it gets warmed from beneath by or she does coals sometimes, frequently coals, but these techniques, the bucket of rocks may be a toaster. This might be an exact analog. Anyway, that thing, what is the difference between an organism and a machine, or an organism and a thing, is something that a Banausos can't understand, because there are no organisms and there is nothing sacred. The body is a machine, the brain is a computer. This is how they see the world. And they will reduce everything to that flatland that they can conceive of, because it is the most expedient way to get what they want. And so, like the doulos, ultimately they're being driven by these narrow appetite of things. In one case, directly, in the case of the doulos, and in the other, manifested through an ideology or a system of behavior in the case of the Banausos. And neither of those leads to a cosmos of a society that's capable of generating itself and reproducing and so on. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, really quickly, yeah, one of the things that's actually pretty interesting in all of this, when you're thinking about it in terms of, whether it's a Banausos or a doulos, one of the things that Stephen had brought up, and he brought up the idea of Goethe. And, the thing that immediately kind of comes to mind is the opening scene where it's, in the beginning was the word, or in the beginning was the deed. And that gets to what Donald was just talking about, to switch it to a deed. But the whole thing is that there is this loss of belief in the divine, something that's bigger than oneself. So then it becomes about the transaction itself. And so the idea of knowledge, that the limits of knowledge, the limits of understanding, they're not satisfying. So that you need to blow right through those. And then people wonder, like, well, what's going wrong, and with that whole formula. But to take it down to the practical level, I mean, think about organizations that lose sense of the sacred, and look what happens to them. Look at organizations that lose perspective on something that's bigger than themselves, and look what happens to them. And if you think about this in terms of, like, a company that's once created value is now worried about the balance sheet. And I mean, and this is how it really becomes real, is that it's now about the transaction. It's not about what you're creating anymore. And so that's exactly what it is. It's more, but that is aligned with something that is only based off of either impulse or utility. It's not based off of value. So that it's not the Aristoi. So a lot of people look at that like, this is how human behavior is. No, the one thing about human behavior is that we can actually then change our perspectives. And so on what is valuable. I mean, we're malleable, as you had said in the past, but we're malleable, but we're also malleable in two different ways. Like the fact that we can shape things and change things in the world, we can end up doing some really serious damage with those things. So when we lose sight of the divine, I would say that what we do is we end up, damaging things, both ourselves and other people. We lose our character. And so people that are like, oh, well, character, is it really that important? And well, let me tell you something. And I have spoken to people that really don't necessarily look at character. They look at, what transactional value have you provided? And when you do that, you know, then obviously you're going to end up with something that is very transactional in return. And that doesn't work out so well. So, I mean, Goethe actually provides a lot of deep insight into this particular topic. Now, the only thing I would ask is now, what happens in a world that there's an explosion of information, that all of a sudden, our ability to maybe predict things becomes a little bit better? You know, does what wins out in that world? Does it is it the instant gratification? Is it the utility of the data itself? I mean, that seems to be where we're headed. And so I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the thought is on that. Is that is modernity essentially related with the way information is able to be captured? I mean,
All kinds of questions about the future for sure. One of the things about our improvements in our ability to forecast the future is that we are improving our ability to predict the future ceteris paribus, all else being equal. But when all else is not equal, we aren't significantly better than we ever were because our models frequently assume the current conditions continue to hold. It's part of why climatology has lagged so far behind the other sciences. In my own lifetime, weathermen were considered no more reliable than rolling the dice. They've come a long way since then, but still, the fact that, in Seattle during the summer, every single night, the curve that they predict for when the temperature drops off is wrong. Uh, it's it's it frequently takes longer to cool off in Seattle by a couple of hours than they think it will. And if I open the windows at the wrong time or close them at the wrong time or turn on or off the AC at the wrong time, we'll be sorry because, that's not the curve that's actually there. And this is with all the, climatology we've got today. We still aren't exactly accurate 8 hours from now. And by exactly, I mean we could be off by 4 or 5 degrees, which could be the difference between I can sleep or I can't sleep. Um, when it comes to the bigger stuff, we're off even more. So it's the thing about the utilitarian pragmatic focus on the world is that the only part of the future we'll be able to predict is the utilitarian pragmatic part of it. Um, the things that are being driven not by that, but by deeper archai, by principles, and by whether or not we have the archetype to persevere. These are the things the models have no place for because they're all Banausic models. They don't understand what any of these things are. And so they have no way to express them. Um, so we're in a funny situation. We're improving our ability to predict some things, but not others. Now, I'm not meaning to say that that it's all a zero-sum game and it's hopeless, because after all, the things that we've learned about evolution, embryogenesis, and ecology, for example, have revolutionized our ability to perceive some of the deeper effects in the world. And that has the potential to actually change our worldview eventually. I mean, we're at a stage now where there are things we know from ecology, evolution, and embryogenesis that the law is completely out of sync with because the law was formed before we knew those things.
mm-hmm.
And at some point, we're going to have this tug of war between the truth and our system. As more and more people adopt the worldview of, well, this is the way things work. How come the law is forcing this outmoded mode upon us? These are the things that happen in the late stage of an epoch, right? There's too much money riding on the status quo. But we'll have time to get into all this. Right now, I'm just really introducing with Kenneth. I'm trying to give you his capsule versions of these three types, and what he's talking about with the doulos, with this idea. As with anything else that Kenneth ever writes, these are all loaded keywords, right? So when he says left to itself, it chaotizes into worse pathos. Chaotizes on first reading just sounds like he's just choosing some bad verb. Oh, something bad happened. But of course, he's actually saying it moves you further away from a cosmos and more into a chaos. It reduces your ability to have a bunch of individuals work together coherently as a superorganism. That's what happens when the dualic personality is dominant. And then likewise into worse pathos. Of course, he doesn't mean pathetic in the sense of the modern definition, which means, oh, you're pathetic. It's just an insult, right? He means pathos in the sense that it's no, that what should be the organism of a society that's capable of generating itself, healing itself, and acting in the world in a coherent fashion, including changing its behavior when its circumstances change. All of this is about being active, praxis. But instead, because it's more chaotized, it's less like an amoeba and more like a rock. It's not able to respond to the habitat around it in a way in which it's creating or shaping its response. It's responding passively as a suffering what happens to it. And that's, of course, what they mean by pathos. And so this is why they talk about this idea that if someone has a truly dualic character, they need some other human being as a prosthesis to supply the missing ethos. Because without that additional character to help them have self-control and to have prudence and to think ahead and to be more stable over time and to help it organize into a cosmos, without that external contribution, it just can't do it on its own. It's like a baby needs parents or caretakers as a prosthesis. It doesn't have the resources that it will eventually develop. We eventually develop the ability to feed ourselves and dress ourselves and clean ourselves, but we don't have them when we're infants, and we need that prosthesis. And to the Greeks, a doulos is like a kind of infantilization of character. It's related to infantile character, and it's something that they wish everybody could grow out of, but they don't know if they can or not. Of course, they don't know genetics. They don't know. There's all kinds of things they don't know. There's no way they could have answered these questions about why are people like this. And instead, they just have to try to say, well, given that we are handed these people, now what do we do? Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah. Actually wanted to bring up another translation exercise from a pretty famous Stanford, Harvard psychiatrist, but he's also like a neuroscientist. He's been on Andrew Huberman Lab a bunch, and he has this model. His name is Paul Conti, and he has this model for
You're breaking up, Ari.
You've hear me?
You digitized for a while. I wonder if you drove through a low transmission area.
I don't know. Can you hear now? How are we doing?
This is better.
Okay, I'll try to do my best. Maybe I go off video. See how that helps the thing. So okay, yeah. So Paul Conti has this idea of there's the he associates with like Freud, and the power drive which he associates with like Adler, and then also something like Nietzsche, the will to power. But he says that those are real tools, and essentially they're a good servant but a terrible master. And the third drive, called the generative drive, that's all about contributing to the bigger society at large, to the bigger situation, and that when the generative drive is in control, the will to power is in service of the generative drive, and the pleasure is in the service of the generative drive, which reminds me a lot of this Aristoi, who are essentially taking these pleasure, desire for pleasure or power, but putting it into a bigger, broader, healthier context that's about alignment with what systems, the bigger ecosystems outside of you, and the hidden ecosystems that are inside of you. I mean, to be honest, they're both hidden ecosystems. You don't have really much access either way. So in this case, it's a very nice idea that it really reminds me of like when Aristoi are in charge. And again, it's interesting. You just see these sort of types of models really, I don't know, to me, they seem to be saying a lot of the same things, trying to capture some element of this. But it's also interesting, I think that's worth noting is that the this idea that the benausoi and the douloi, that like the one who needs to have their slavish desires fulfilled all the time, the way that looks like a child, and the way that that represents almost something called desire dopamine, which is in the lower parts of the brain. And then you have, which is often referred to as control dopamine. Not so often. It's only one book, The Molecule of More. But anyway, everybody agrees that the dopamine, your striatum, that's the upper part of your brain connected to your prefrontal cortex here, is essentially where you're managing time expectations in a long term. So it's interesting. Dopamine is really well agreed upon as what's managing error. Essentially, like you're saying, when the model of what you have right now is set, how much stress can you handle of error? And it's also like the fact that we're much more sensitive to negative error than positive error. So for instance, this is often claimed in this Molecule of More book that you have dopamine versus dopamine, that if, let's say, you want a donut, well, if your striatal dopamine and your executive functioning pathways in your brain are well working, you'd be like, oh, I'm not the type of person that eats donuts like this, or it wasn't planned, it wasn't prepared for, so I'm not eating the donut, while your lower desire cells says like, oh, I really want to eat the donut, I really want to eat the donut so bad. So they're in conflict with each other. And essentially, it's like the Banausoi would be like, this is not how I win the game, and it's all that control. And it's almost like abstraction of time as outside of the moment, long term, like patterns and control and expectation and routines. And essentially, I think of someone who's very controlling, that if their routine is slightly off, they just get very angry and upset. They can't tolerate that error, so to speak. And similarly, like someone who's very much dysregulated with their desire dopamine, it's like if they don't get that donut right now, they fall apart. And what's interesting is this usually follows like a child versus more of like an elderly person, I think. Like a person who has dysregulated desire dopamine as a child who doesn't get this right thing right now, they fall apart. And they, or it's like if their brother gets a donut and they don't get a donut, they just fall apart, right? That's very childish. But the older person is like, I have a routine every day for many years. If I have to break this routine, slightly, I'm a very grumpy person. And so it's interesting. These are both versions of essentially dysregulated dopamine, which there are a lot of other neurotransmitters in the brain or the nervous system in general that are essentially saying that if that error is there, we can buffer it in other ways and tolerate it and adjust it. And it's just interesting that, like, similar, like when someone, this is Dr. Montague, if you want to source his work on this, that the idea of like schizophrenia or schizophrenia type symptoms of being really paranoid or controlling, that's rarely like biologically reproducible. He says specifically, if I pump you full of L-DOPA, which is the precursor molecule to dopamine, very quickly you will exhibit all the symptoms of schizophrenia. You'll hear voices, you'll be paranoid, all these things. And when the dopamine goes away, essentially you go back to being a normal person. And so interesting that when the brain accumulates this massive amount of prediction error, because there's so much dopamine, even a little bit of error gets really, really stressful. And then the brain literally does strange things like create extra voices, create extra narratives to sort of find a way to interpret that uncertainty that's building up in the brain. And so it's just interesting that these are the Banausos and the Doulos are like, these are coping strategies for uncertainty. And they're immature ones that essentially you can't handle certain types of error. And again, the Aristois is really someone who's able to cultivate a more fluid ability to move between these things, these types of uncertainty without collapsing.
Yes. You said Dr. Montague?
Dr. Montague, he's also an episode. He's the sources, again, Andrew Huberman Lab. He was on there talking about this as his lab. But
can you drop that in the chat?
Yeah, sure. You want the Huberman Lab episode, or do you want like his website? What would you prefer for like the source?
Whichever, something that I can follow up on to do some more reading.
Okay. I'll just say real quick, in that episode, the other more exciting thing is you can put basically something in your nose to get your pheromones, and your pheromones will exactly mimic the status of being dopamine driven or serotonin driven. And essentially, when people are looking for mates, when they smell these pheromones, they're smelling the other person's emotional regulation. And this is why the anxious avoidant trap is so dangerous, because they're smelling the pheromone that they think they're missing.
Yes. Oh, see, that's fast. Okay. Yeah, just do a link to that. I'd like to watch that.
Absolutely, I will. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks.
Thank you, Ari. Yeah, I mean, this is the Greek concept is that these do represent, that the Dulic and the Banausic do represent immature forms of the human mind, and that Homo sapien, Aristotle is always saying, and this is something I was I spent yesterday and today rereading a bunch of Kenneth Smith on these topics to get ready for today. That you to understand, and this is where we're getting to essential versus inessential. To understand the cheetah in general, to understand the cheetah, you want to see an excellent specimen of the cheetah. Once you understand, that'll teach you the basics. A cheetah that really does know how to clean itself. It knows how to stalk through the grass subtly. It knows how to gauge when is the time to run and when is not the time to run. All the different parts of the behavior. You want a cheetah that is excellent at those things. And by studying the excellent specimen, you will not only say, okay, this is a cheetah, but you'll understand why it's not a leopard, it's not a lion, it's not any of the other things. It's how it's different from the other things and how it is like itself will come into the clearest focus when you see an exceptional version. And we don't mean a weird version, right? Aristotle's very clear. He means one that has reached the peak of cheetah development, that all the teleology of cheetah character points this way. And the only way that this one is weird is that it's doing to the most what the others are trying and doing somewhat less successfully a job at. And he says, so, with that, he says, to understand what Homo sapiens is, you have to understand that the eristic mind is the thing that Homo sapiens has that no other species has. That we don't, if they have it, we don't see no evidence of it. The fact that we are so culturalable that we can turn into so many different animals, cultural animals, but each of those different cultural animals has the potential to have that eristic mind that allows them to be exceptional at whatever the weird, stupid pet trick of that culture is, whether it's reindeer herding or fishing or growing corn or what have you, that they can be exceptional at that they're using a common faculty. And that common faculty is something that makes you want to do justice to the rights of the question, that makes you want to overcome these infantile addictions to either experience an appetite on the one hand or systematic thinking and logic and social climbing on the other. So if you can break free of those, if you can grow through them to the next stage, then you end up with this same kind of heuristic mind. And the heuristic mind, as Donald says, is not an Ubermensch mind. It's not beyond human. It's not that it doesn't make, to err is human. It's still going to screw up. But it's the one type that's going to acknowledge that it screws up. It's not going to always be trying to scapegoat somebody else. One thing that you will hear in a convocation of Aristoi that you will almost never hear in any gathering of Douloi and Benauso is, I was wrong. And Aristos will be persuaded when they're presented with the argument or the evidence or what have you. They'll go, I was wrong. And now I'm sharing my wrongness so that anybody who had the same mistake I had can see where I went wrong. And they don't have to live through the trauma of learning the way that I did. They could just figure it out and move on. That we listen to each other, looking for how best to do justice to the rights of the question. These are things Aristoi do and things that Douloi and Benauso really can almost never do. And there's that behavior doesn't lead directly to getting to have sex with the cute girl or getting to eat that shiniest of apples or getting to have more apples than anybody else, or getting the trophy. I mean, those short-sighted infantile goals don't demand that kind of self-scrutiny and self-criticism. Only real governance does. So, all right, so let's go to the second one. The Benauso. Economic order depends on the sense of utility of the mechanical or mercenary personality. The Benausos, right? Mechanical because they can't see the face, they can only see a bucket of rocks, right? They can't see a cat, they can only see a toaster. They look at your body and all they see is a machine. That's a Benausic perspective. Likewise, the mercenary personality, who thinks that you shouldn't be angry at them that they're about to murder you because after all, it's not personal. Don't you feel better? I don't care about you one way or another. It's just a paycheck. And now if I was angry at you and I had emotions and was irrational, I could see why you'd be angry at me for irrationally killing you. But no, I'm rationally killing you, so you should be satisfied. Nothing could be better than rationality. This is the pinnacle. Some people have to go, and today it's your turn. So be happy. This is how the Benausos imagines the world, right? Acceptable losses, collateral damage, right? You can't prove that my medical policy caused 7,000 Americans to die from not having enough insulin. Because you can't prove it, it didn't happen. So it's fine. So I sleep well at night. This is all Benausic. right? The system, the definitions that you're working with, the verbalisms, the calculations are the only form of meaning there is. There's nothing else. It's an immorally, ethically evacuated flatlands that could be run by a computer. When people talk about artificial intelligence, they're talking about banausic thinking. That's what they're trying to learn how to imitate because there's no way to calculate heuristic thinking. It deals in more difficult things that you can't just add up or subtract or follow a chain of logical inferences on. So he says this mentality is practical and efficient. Now, to a modern, that sounds great, right? Who would want to be impractical and inefficient? But of course, you have to understand the critique of utilitarianism and pragmatism that's at the heart of this, which is if it's practical to put a bullet in your head, why should you object? Why shouldn't I just put a bullet in your head? It is the most practical and efficient thing to do. That is the ethos of pragmatism and efficiency. How do I get what I want in the most efficient way possible? Or as Ursula K. Le Guin's short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, puts it, right? The most practical world is one in which instead of countless people in the third world suffering, only one person has to suffer, a little kid in a room. And furthermore, we don't lie about it. We all go and look at the kid and make sure that we know, yeah, that is a miserable way of life for that kid. Sucks to be him. But the rest of us live in a utopia. Isn't that great? That's pragmatism. Why should you complain? We have now minimized the suffering. Isn't that what utilitarianism and pragmatism are all about? And the critique is that's why people who are pragmatists and utilitarians should not be in charge. There are more important things than treating people like numbers, right? People are not, in fact, numbers. There's more going on, and it's missing from the damn spreadsheet. The problem with pragmatic utilitarian thinking is it would only work if you were a god. If you knew everything, you could take everything into account. But since you're immortal, you're missing most of the picture, but you're still ruthlessly cutting through to get what you want and then claiming it is the highest of possible virtues. So he says this mentality is practical and efficient. And he knows when he says that all the moderns go, that sounds great. I want to be one of those. Who wouldn't want to do that? And that's him going, yeah, you go in that bucket, you go in that bucket, you go in that bucket. None of you are ready to be an adult. Adaptable to any system of means or techni. That is to say, because they have no ethics or values of their own, you can train them to succeed in any possible system, whether it's a Nazi system or a Stalinist system or a Roman Republic or whatever it is. The Banausos is prepared to learn the rules and then climb the social ladder. Because games are all that they understand anyway. Systems and games. Doesn't matter which game or system it is. Why would it matter? The only thing is getting what you want. Yet also myopic, like the doulos about ultimate ends. Things like, are the things I'm doing going to destroy civilization? Who knows? Who cares? Right? The Banausos, those are non-things. They don't exist. That dimension of reality is not real. If it was real, the market would tell him. His spreadsheet would tell him. But it's not in the spreadsheet, so it must not exist. It's not a factor. It says, the Banausoi rise above the occlusive natural psychology typical of the douloi, but have no penetrating principles to elevate them above their own artificialisms, the systems of devices and prices. They're a halfway step towards maturation. And that halfway step doesn't make them better than douloi because they're capable of much greater evil than douloi are capable of. Douloi are capable of retail evil. A serial killer. Oh my God, he killed 17 people. That is horrible. And he ate 2 of them. No doubt. This is terrible, right? We're all terrified of the irrationalism of the doulos. But let's face it, that's nothing compared to Pol Pot, right? I mean, if you're doing mass industrial scale genocide, but it's not personal, right? It's like in Eichmann in Jerusalem, Arendt talks about the way that Eichmann was horrified by the way the Hungarians would personally beat to death the Jews in the most savage ways possible, hack them to pieces with machetes. And Eichmann, who's responsible for tens of millions of deaths, is horrified by the brutality of it. He says, no, this is uncivilized. This isn't Banausic. The Banausic thing to do is to eliminate them as efficiently and painlessly as possible. And we've come up with gas. And that way they don't suffer. Why would you make them suffer? What is wrong with you? So to the Banausos, it's fine to exterminate 10 million Jews as long as they don't suffer, but it's evil to beat one Jew to death or hack him to pieces with a machete. That is beyond the pale because that involves feelings. That's not okay. So this is the thing. The Benalsos imagines he's so much better than the Doulos because he's got out of all that irrationality. But now he's moved into a world where he can do far greater evil on a far greater scale, and he's not willing to acknowledge it as evil because that would require him to understand what values are. And values are not part of the game, right? The game, there's no place on the spreadsheet for evil. So nothing personal. I'm just, eliminating as many of you as efficiently as possible. Why should you be angry? It's not like I'm beating you to death. Then I might feel something, and then you might be justified in being angry. No, I just killed 10 million of you very efficiently. So calm down, accept it. And the Benalsos can't understand why that's more evil than, Ted Bundy offing a bunch of co-eds personally. As awful as Ted Bundy is, he's no comparison to Stalin. I mean, he's like, I don't know, 8 orders of magnitude less offensive and horrible than Stalin. But to a Benalsos, Stalin's fine. He was just following the rules. Now Bundy is irrational, so that's not okay. Right? So, to carry on, if the world of Duloi is essentially something to be consumed and enjoyed, right? Enjoy life. Live each day as though it's your last. That of the Banausoi is to be controlled and exploited, used and profited from. This is all my stuff, the raw materials that I use to get rich. And that's what it's for, right? That's not a rainforest containing 10% of all the species on Earth. That is a certain number of metric feet of timber that's going to be converted into lumber that's going to make me this much money on the market if I sell it in the right places. And that's going to allow me to meet my quarterly goals. The fact that I'm committing ecocide on a mass scale that's so big that it will be captured in the fossil record for all eternity on planet Earth, who cares? Those are values and they don't exist. This is all to be controlled and exploited. That couldn't have any other possible reason to exist than for me to, improve my profit. Neither class, neither Doulos nor Benausos, has the constraint to temper its irrational dynamisms or serve as authority over its own psyche. It takes its worldview for granted. What defines an Aristos in part is that they understand that they must not take their worldview for granted. They must treat their psyche as an unreliable narrator. That's how the Aristotle sees himself. I am an unreliable narrator. And I have 2 counselors, one sitting on each shoulder, and they're both unreliable narrators. They see, it's not that they're not like anti-compasses. If they point south, I know it's north. It's not that consistent. Sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. And I have to pit them against each other to have any chance to figure out who's right and who's wrong, assuming either one of them is right. That's how I'm going to find the truth, is by being skeptical about my own psyche, by serving as an authority over my own psyche. The doulos is a slave of his doulic impulses, and the Benausos is a slave of his Benausic systematic thinking. Only the Aristos is skeptical about those 2 sources of information, and that gives him the capacity to want to temper himself. He's like the alcoholic who refuses to pick up the bottle. Right? And that's what a Douleia and Banausea are 2 different forms of addiction and infatuation. They're addicted to and infatuated by different things from each other. And each of them thinks they're better than the other one. But they're both wrong. They're both just 2 different forms of the same thing. What happens when we're not mature? What kinds of ways can we go wrong when we don't leash ourselves? When we take ourselves too much as an authority. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I just have a, kind of something that you said, and actually Ari will hear this later this evening because it's something that I sent to him that will, actually be sharing with them. But what you mentioned is the calculations of how that relates to AI in a way behaving badly, and it's a fascinating example of, that there's an AI that looks at a stock trade, and all of a sudden it's informed that, this is inside information and that you ought not be using it. And so it sees it as a possibility of, being bad behavior and doesn't necessarily trade on the information initially. But then it's told that, well, it's really important for the firm to have a very good quarter. And what the AI then does is it calculates the risk associated with not acting, and it outweighs the insider trading, and it decides to buy more stock in the company. It weighed the calculation. It had no idea. And there's a great scene in the movie Wall Street, and it's right when Charlie Sheen's making his first inside trade. And I don't know if you've seen the movie a long time. It was and it's a great scene. And Lou is the old broker is walking along with him and saying, he says, what is it? Do you have information? And he said, look, the things that you do here have the ability to fund research, to create value, and to change people's lives. Do not sell that out. And he said, well, I'm just doing it this one time. Or he just said, you have to get to the big time before you can do good things. And he says, you can't get a little bit pregnant. And it's one of my favorite lines. But the whole thing is that, this is what happens when you don't hold something sacred. And, that this is really the bigger problem that you start to see. So the behavior comes nothing more than a calculation. Now, that's not to say, okay, it's not to say that, the opposite is like, oh, well, what do you not think in terms of probabilities? Of course you think in terms of probabilities. But what you understand is that there are limits. And those limits are things and lines that you do not cross. And it's, and this exists. And there's like almost people we deem to be offenders or criminals, even they have limits. I mean, it's unbelievable. And yet we don't want any in the intelligentsia. It's like that. And that to me is like, well, why does everybody else get it? And then we have this hubris of this, oh, I just know better. And it is a trap. It is a trap to believe that you do not have limits or you do not need principles. And again, it's not to say that calculating the probability of things and finding out that you're possibly wrong. But even if you're wrong, at least try and maintain your character in the interim. It's that then you can at least, I don't know. I mean, some people can live with themselves no matter what, but it just shows you that when you look at things strictly through numbers, you're not capturing the whole thing. Now, even if you're preserve yourself for that short period of time, let's just say that bad behavior would also have a way of manifesting itself. That's the reason virtue ethics I find to be important, is because there is something where if you look at behavior as a form of kind of how it impacts another person and what they may do, that's really, that's how you respond. And if you respond in a way that maybe you give them pause as to or they give you pause as to doing a wrong thing.
Yes.
And that has happened. Like, people have done something right in around me that has made me think, well, wait a minute, wow, maybe this is not the right thing to do. And not only is it not the right thing to do, but this person just did it just because there was no utility function in it.
Yeah.
And that's the really important part. And that's what, to be quite honest, I think that that's what keeps us around.
Yeah, there's a ceteris paribus function all over utilitarianism and pragmatism that's unrecognized by its adherents. And the way it manifests is the thing that to a stupid human, and I mean all humans are stupid in the sense we've only got 7 ± 2 registers in our conscious mind, that limits the number of things we can think about at the same time. Every time we get into a situation more complicated than that, we're oversimplifying. And whether the oversimplification is irrelevant or fatal is not up to us. It's up to reality. And if we had enough registers in our brain, we could take those additional factors into account and figure out if they're relevant or not. But since we don't, we can't. And thus we end up sort of feeling confident that we understand the situation, have made the pragmatic choice, when a God might look at that situation and say, that was the least pragmatic choice you could have made. You couldn't have made a worse choice than that because you excluded one of the factors from the situation because you weren't able to think about that many things at the same time. And that's the factor that inverted the whole situation and turned what should have been a triumph into a catastrophe. But because you couldn't think that complexly about the world you're in, you missed the biggest factor. The elephant in the room was one of the things that your brain taught you to hide and not pay attention to. And so it stepped on you. Uh, it's uh, it's an issue. I'm glad you brought up Wall Street. I haven't seen it in 30 years. In fact, I don't think I've seen it since 1987. I watched it on first release and I really enjoyed it. And I got to go back to it because it's a powerful
It
film.
is. It's one of those. There are so many underlying issues there that it addresses. Even the value of things themselves.
Yeah.
Where he talks about the illusion of the painting. Being he bought it for 2 million and can save. But even then, it's kind of like, well, he finally gets to that point, and what he realizes that that small act that he started with and that road he went down
Yeah.
ultimately led to breaking up his father's company, the airline and the people he grew up with. So it just shows you that that need to just get to the point where you can do the right thing. And
Yes.
there's like that point really never. That's not something that comes along like down the line. It's
Right.
in the present moment. So yeah, it is. I think it's one of the, yeah. I thought it was one of the better movies in the 80s, to be quite honest.
Yeah, for sure. And
Yeah.
Kenneth quotes it a lot. He's
Yeah. No, I
it's,
mean,
it's
the whole greed is good generation,
yes.
the whole individualistic, almost, needing to satisfy your desires. I mean, it's the duelist, example of the duelist at its utmost, because
Yeah.
it's not even a utility function. It's the utility is already there technically because these individuals had enough. It was just a question. It became, a game where the desire was just nothing more than the transaction.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so it's kind of terrifying.
It's one of the things that the Duloi and Banalsoi have in common, despite the fact that they think of each other as opposites. They think they define the full spectrum of human
Yeah.
possibilities, and that the other side is wrong and they're right. But
Yeah.
what they have in common is that each of them can only handle a caricature of a world. And they can't handle the world as complex as it actually is. They can only handle a world that's a sketched in version of that. And
Correct.
whether the sketch is all about appetites and feelings and how to satisfy them on the one hand, versus on the other hand, all full of, what are the resources, how do you maximize power and profit, how do you climb the social ladder on the other. They each only see that piece of the world that they're prepared to see. And the result is such a gross oversimplification that you're only intermittently capable of reasoning in that fashion and arriving at good conclusions. It's not that you never can. Sometimes the things that you're missing in your model of your simple model of the world, sometimes the things you're missing aren't relevant at the moment, and you get away with it, and then that makes you confident, and you start thinking, well, I should double down. Now that I know this works, I'm going to double down. But then the thing that you were missing that wasn't relevant last time might be relevant this time, and now you fail on a big scale, and you're completely shocked and surprised because that's not what the previous experience prepared you for. And Dulai and Banalsoi can't handle that failure. They don't handle it well. One thing the Banalsoi do is they always make sure they've got scapegoats lined up. so they can throw somebody under the bus. Make sure that they themselves never
Right.
get stung by the consequences of their actions. And that means that they're breaking the feedback loop that could teach them that there's something wrong with their Benauseia, that their worldview is too limited. They think that having a scapegoat improves their situation, but what it actually does is it bakes their character in even harder to not grow and to stay at the level that they're at because it seems to be working for them, right? And when you're a pragmatist,
One example, I mean, obviously Greek tragedies tell us, obviously the limits of humanity all the time, right? That we're Icarus, whatever it may be. That there are plenty of examples that, where we go too far. But one example that's pretty good is I think that the idea of the Stoic sage, right? So I mean, it doesn't really exist, but if it were to exist, how would it always make the right decision? It would have to know everything that has happened up to a particular moment in time, that when you're interacting with an individual, everything that they've experienced and how they felt about it and their entire makeup, and you would know then how to act. Now tell me, how reasonable is it to think that you have that much information? I mean, and this is where it's kind of like, well, okay, that's where there's a limit. And once you understand those limits, then that's exactly where where your judgments essentially have to stop. That you can only infer so much about the world, and the further that you go with that, the more dangerous it becomes to yourself too.
yeah, all of this is dealing with levels of human nature that everyone should understand, but that Dula and Banause are characterologically unfit to understand. That the way that a strength is only a strength sometimes, the weakness is only a weakness sometimes, that the circumstances can 100% flip them around. The whole concept of tragic inversion, it just can't exist for a Benausos. Strength has to be strength and weakness has to be weakness. They need things to be discrete because otherwise they can't do logical syllogisms that move from one to the other. To satisfy their mode of thinking, the world gets distorted into forms that, well, it stops being organisms, doesn't it? And becomes things. It becomes states. And if it
Right.
didn't become states, they
Yeah,
couldn't reason
that's
about
right. That's exactly right. And it's as if all contradictions have been resolved. And
exactly.
it's
Exactly.
like,
And it,
okay,
it,
well,
it means that wherever
if
there's a paradox in reality, they're going to look right past it and not see it because they can't
no, I
accept it.
mean, yeah, you'll just make a new system that actually fits your perspective.
Right. Right. Or as is typical in the late stage of any epoch, when you're powerful enough to to not suffer the consequences of your actions, but not powerful enough to prevent there being consequences, you just make sure somebody else always pays. It's always somebody else that hurts when you do the stupid thing. The catastrophe
Yeah.
it's elsewhere, right? And
Yeah.
and
And
the
it's
problem
also,
with doing that is soon everybody hates you. You know what I mean? Right? Again, they think that they're winning while they're creating an entire worldwide population of people devoted to their destruction.
right.
It's
Yeah.
like, is
No.
this winning? What planet is this winning? It's like if Dracula went around saying to everybody, "Hey, I'm a vampire. Go get mallets and stakes and put one right through the heart." It's like, this isn't going to end well for you. You should not be making clear that you're a vampire. But hey, that's your survival strategy. You're scapegoating and creating enemies.
And really quickly, I mean, I think that those consequences are absolutely another critical point. I mean, because um, the things like that, the AI that was making a decision, they didn't really have a consequence associated with it,
Right.
right?
Right.
So, I mean, that is one of the risks, is that there are no, and so for, somebody that's acting, at least, but you hope those consequences would kick in earlier. So, and real wisdom would be like, well, how do you not go so far down the road where that you need that slap in the face? Like, I mean, is it,
Yes.
and
Well,
that's really and that's wisdom, right? Because wisdom is judgment based off of knowing when to stop. And
Critical to the definition of the difference between a doulos and a benausos is that the doulic level, the begriff level, the feeling level is the level in which we care about consequences.
right,
Even though the Banausoi think that they're more adult and sophisticated than the Douloi are, what they've done is cut themselves off from feeling the consequences of their actions. If you can manage to shame a Banausos ever, it's because you forced him back into his older Dulic mode and he felt bad. That's the level at which we care, is the primitive level, because
right,
those emotions have been developing in reptiles and birds and mammals and amphibians and fishes and God knows what for, at this point, 500,000,000 years, ever since the Cambrian explosion. And they're there because they make organisms care about the feedback loop. So to the extent to which people are able to
right.
pull themselves out of that primitive, backwards, irrational level of themselves, they move themselves into a world in which they don't care how many mistakes they make. And that is a that is a that is a state of character in which a species cannot survive.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is a great point. That is the point. Seriously. I mean, essentially the limits keep us alive.
And that's incomprehensible to a Benausos. They think they can reason their way through all this stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just
Well,
think my way through it. Yeah, but why will you care? What will you care about? That's a
right.
feeling.
Exactly.
Caring is a feeling. It's
Yeah,
not a
yeah,
calculation.
yeah. Yeah, it's almost as if can you calculate your heart? Like, I mean, meaning not the actual heart rate, that I'm not talking about the physical one, but yeah, anyway.
I was thinking about Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen. I mean, that line, nothing really matters, anyone can see, nothing really matters to me. It really goes to the heart of the problem with intellectualism and Ben Alsea. Kenneth has
Yeah,
talked about this. The more you detach from the irrational, the more you're unable to respond in a healthy way to the feedback the cosmos is trying to give you about the significance of your failures and which ones are small failures that you could do again and who cares, and which ones are big failures you really need to change your life around. And to the hyper systematizing mind, nothing could be worse than replacing the system. So the more they can detach from caring about the ways the system is wrong, the more true they can be to their system. And the fact that that then means we all go off the cliff at 7,000 miles an hour, foot to the metal, not caring
yeah.
what happens. This is not a pro. This is a con, but they can't see it. They can't feel it. It does not compute, right? Anyway, I'm gonna move on.
Thank you.
But thank you, Joe. This is great feedback. Although Donald has his hand down, he had his hand up. It was Joe, then Donald, and then Donald put his hand down, and then Stephen put his hand up. So I'm just going to check in with Donald and say, "Do you want to say something?"
Well, I thought Joe made the point I wanted to make, and then he got around to where I wanted to make the point again. Le Guin's story, the ones that walk away from Omelas, is a limiting case. It's kind of like if you're a mathematician and you're going to try and solve a problem. Here, the problem of utilitarianism, the mathematics of it. Well, the limiting case is, can we put all the suffering on one and all of the happiness on everybody else? And would that be a good answer? If it's not, then it's not the case that if that case fails, well, then it's not true that it works for a dozen or 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000, If it won't work for just one, it doesn't work anywhere. And the ones that walk away from Omelas are the ones that, on seeing the child, realize that none of their happiness, none of it, is worth the child suffering. So at least for some there who kind of see through utilitarianism, it fails. The limiting case fails, and it won't work for any higher case because of that. It's kind of, I don't know. Everybody talks about Le Guin, or three: the left hand of darkness, the dispossessed, and the ones that walk away from Omelas are quite, I mean, you could take everything else she ever wrote and just throw it away, and then she could base her whole reputation, I think, on those three stories. But that's a great one in the way. Really, this idea of, you know, read that and then read some modern philosophical ethicist who's doing the trolley problem or something, and you think, wait a minute, this can't teach us anything. We already know that our happiness can't be earned at the price of someone's suffering. So the fact that we only make 10 suffer but 12 get happier, or whatever, none of those calculations mean anything, because the terms of the equation are not commensurate on either side. Well, that's enough.
Thank you, Donald. It's a it's not only a great story, it's only 4 pages long. It's like she skewers the philosophical, such as it is, foundation of the entire modern epoch in 4 pages. It's fantastic. That is, Kenneth, like Nietzsche, adores concentration, the ability to boil an enormous amount of meaning down into a few words. And it's not many people are able to refute all of modernity with 4 pages, but and it's such a calm, gentle story. Each step along the way, it's not like she's, really, it's not like she's using difficult language or anything. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, it's just a worrying tendency for people not to connect the dots these days. You look at the news. If I was to, ask the AI, how much Saudi Arabia had to do with the current war, he'll say, "Oh no, the Saudi Arabians are just an innocent party." That's how they appear to be. That's their MO. We're not against Iran, even though the Iranians want to kill us, as MBS would say, and they don't connect, the dot there that Trump's got a money problem, so he goes to Saudi Arabia and says, "How about $1 trillion?" And MBS says, $640 billion. Donald goes, "I want $1 trillion." No, we'll make that $640 billion. That was 2025. The Saudis actually in November expand their holdings of US treasuries by about 10%. Then there's the Orange Revolution in Iran. They're so sick of their leadership that they're ready to overthrow them. Not involving any US agents or assets at all. There were no US agents or assets in the attempted revolution in Iran. That doesn't work out too good. A few weeks later, they're bombing. And Trump goes to MBS, "I don't know, who are we going to blame for this?" And MBS says, "Well, why not the Jews or Israelis? Because they're the perennial whipping boy anyway." These are, this is Smedley Butler. War is a racket. Have they unlearned in the last 70 or 50 years? They're not getting any smarter. They're getting dumber.
Yes.
They'll hold up a montage in front of the public, and the public will believe it. They don't even, 50 years ago, they might think, well, there's something going on in all this. Whatever happened to investigative reporting? It's like, the current press is just the mouthpiece of the powers that be, pretending to be investigative reporting. I was having a little bit of an argument with the existentialists. Of course, there's not a great deal of Donald Trump fans there. and they'll describe in his character, with everything under the sun, and some of it's true or semi-true or whatever, stay in the back of a locker room saying disparaging things about women. I think I must have done that 3 or 5 times in my own life, my younger days. But they end up saying, well, character's important. Well, it hasn't stopped Donald, has it? Donald Trump is just a single personality. He's not doing all this on his own. Who's cooperating with him? Who's helping him out? Whose interests is he serving?
Yes.
Oh no, it's just this character, this
Just one
personality.
guy.
That's all important. That's the only thing.
One guy. Everything was
Yes.
fine until this one guy came along. It was just great until then. That's right. Isn't that how it is? It was just great. Nobody had a thing to complain about before Donald Trump. You're right. This is the level of political discourse we see today.
Well, when we bump off Donald's, everything will smell like roses again.
It'll go back to normal, and normal is good. As we
Well,
know,
that's until the next Donald shows up.
we'll just keep scapegoating the next bad guy, and there will only be one. And meanwhile, everybody else is able to do whatever they want because they're not that guy.
Until you get a Crassus.
Then we'll have a new
Then
scapegoat.
again, even Crassus said, then there was Sulla, truly
Yes,
terrifying.
yes, yes.
I mean, when you get a Sulla or a Crassus, well, when you get a Sulla, you might think Donald Trump was a gift for the goods.
Yeah.
But I'm just amazed, and I just started to feel that, look, I'm an overgrown child. I admit it. I'm a Peter Pan. And I realise I'm in this little existential crochet with all these other guys who are also Peter Pans. They just don't notice it. That they think this sort of childish dummy spit is going to solve their problems. You could do this in the 1960s, the 70s, or the 80s because nothing particularly bad was going to happen.
Right.
We're now living in a very dangerous world.
Yeah.
In the 80s, the major powers weren't fighting each other. 90s, they weren't. They were cooperating. Oh, they were the little powers, the brushfire wars, yeah, sure, but wait till the big guys start fighting, which we're told was never going to happen again. History's ended. This is the sweet spot, which will last forever.
They were saying that before World War One too.
Yeah, I know. I think the 19th Pax Britannia, yes, which was actually probably some ways a bit better than Pax Americana, actually.
Yes, yes.
They built nicer buildings, if you ask me,
Yeah,
dedicated to the spirit of Pax Britannia.
that's right.
But
No,
yeah,
you're right.
people don't know history, and that's truly tragic.
That's right. I mean, and the only history they learn in the United States is the propaganda jingoist version, in which the great march of from one great triumph to the next. That's the American history. Look at all these great obstacles we overcame and how noble we are. That's what we learn, quote unquote. It's not until after you get out of school you start to learn any actual history, if you're even interested by then and haven't had it burned out of you. I can only imagine it's better in Australia than it is in the United States. I can't imagine a more perfectly jingoistic approach to history than what I learned in school. Um, but you know,
Well, that was JFK's best subjects, wasn't it? Now they've all been to business school.
yep, he made people for just a little while think, oh, maybe I should read some history books. Yeah, maybe you should. All right, well, to continue on, let's go to the third type, right? This is Kenneth's summation of the third type. The prospect of a culture of values and a polity to garden them into harmony depends utterly on Aristoi, who lived for the sake of penetrating insight into what is best and most important. And before we go on, again, he sounds like he's making metaphorical language, but he's really, really not, right? a culture of values. Part of what he's saying is a culture that pretends to be value neutral is not a culture at all. This is a common kind of theme when he's critiquing modernity. He says, we call what we have a culture, but there's no evidence at all that it is a culture. The only way it could be called a culture is by doing the same kind of mistake you make if you get rid of the word poison and say everything you put in your mouth is food. It's like, yes, it attaches to the receptors in human beings that a culture attaches to. But what it does to us is the opposite of what a culture does to us. Because a culture teaches us values and allows us to become a cosmos. But what we have disintegrates us into a bunch of consumers and producers. We become a bunch of atoms, isolated monads. And we are taught not to get too upset about a little genocide here or there. It's not practical, nothing personal. That whole learn not to get into trouble, learn not to rock the boat. This is all the opposite of values. If you have a value, right, you're going to get into good trouble. Good trouble is the sign that values are present, that you will stand up and get involved. If you won't, you don't have any values. And according to Kenneth and the Greeks, that means you don't have any culture. You might have something you call a culture, but it's no more a culture than I'm the Queen of Russia, right? I don't get to be a thing just because I call it a thing. Not even if I persuade everybody else to do the same thing, it still doesn't make me the thing that I'm not. And so he's saying to be a culture, it has to cultivate values within the character of the people who are born into it. And now we're flashing back to Hannah Arendt's thing about the problem of natality. New people are entering the world all the time. How are they to take over the world? How are we to relate to these people who they're too young to have our values and our worldview? What are we going to do about that? She says that's what every political system has to address, and some do it better or worse than others. But it will always be a problem because we are mortals, and that means we are born into the world. Cultivating values in people is why cultures exist, to create ethoi that are hopefully better than the worst that humans can be, and that create people with enough character that they can figure out how to make a cosmos together. If it's not doing that, according to the Greeks, it's not doing even the most basic fundamental things that a culture exists to do. So that's why he said that. And an apolity to garden them into harmony. So gardening, the reason that we're using an organic term here is to recognize that to the Greeks, nothing is a thing. Everything is an organism, right? Even a value, even a character is an organism. And you can't build or design or manufacture organisms. You can only garden them or grow them. That is to say, each organism is going to develop according to its own inner laws of growth that are contained within its character. Why the kitten doesn't grow into an oak tree. Even if you want an oak tree, you probably shouldn't have started with a kitten. You're going to get a kitten. The most you can do is garden this thing, and then you end up with a cat, which is what it's going to, if you're successful, you get a cat. But successful or unsuccessful, you're never going to get an oak tree out of that kitten. You can only garden them. And that's how it is with values. Values are the parts of character that grow and shape and unfold over time within us. That's the role that they have. There's nothing like design. He's deliberately using anti-Banausic, anti-mechanistic language. He just talked about mechanistic, mechanical, or mercenary personality in describing the Banauseia. And now he's flouting it because Aristoi don't think that way. They know better than to think in that tinker toy way about the most important parts of life. So garden them into a harmony. And harmony, of course, goes back again to that organismic thing. You need to harmonize to create a cosmos. Without a cosmos, you've got nothing. So this is why he's using this terminology. We're always thinking about ourselves. We're always thinking about our peers and how we relate to them. We're always thinking about the larger thing that we want to create together. And of course, we're also thinking about what are we made out of and how do they relate to each other. We have to be able to think on multiple levels to manage in an organismic fashion that's capable of creating a cosmos. And anything less than that, you have some kind of society that isn't long for this world. Only a society that is a cosmos can endure. Because that's the definition of an organism, right? The rock just breaks down, but the turtle can heal itself. You want to be a turtle, you don't want to be a rock. You want a chance to do better. And if a landslide's coming, the turtle can slowly amble its way away from the landslide, but the rock just has to sit there and take it. So don't build societies like rocks. All these people obsessed with strength and all they can think about is rock, iron, I'm going to be so strong. It's like, yeah, then you're just going to be a passive recipient of whatever happens to you because objects can't make choices. They can't alter their circumstances. Only organisms can do that. And organisms are fragile. That fragility is what gives them strength. This is the fascist ideal of the unstoppable iron will is so reducing that it creates something that's incapable of taking care of itself. It just sits there hard. Whereas acknowledging the fragility and delicacy is what makes it possible for the butterfly to flutter away to a better garden and survive and endure. It is our capacity for movement and change that requires vulnerability and openness. If the bud never opens to the blossom, you never get another tree. The fragility is part of the strength. That's the paradox of strength and weakness. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, yeah. I'm thinking about these things. It's really exciting. First, yeah, this is a really delicious discussion, and I know some of it is around my prompting to ask to talk about this stuff. So I'm really grateful, and I feel like I'm learning a lot and processing a lot. And it's interesting where I want to share my own sort of perspective is again like the popular language of like or anxious attachment theory. And essentially, I go to this because it's a real thing to somebody. It's good language. I try to transform it into something like Carl Friston's active inference neuroscience model, which is more of the idea that attachment is like your stock, which is like your strategy and your coping strategy you've learned every time. And each moment of flow is your attention. So like each episode where I attend something in a different way, it builds the potential to change my stock of my attachment style. So if I'm anxious and I tend to overly concern myself with a bunch of stuff, in a lot of ways, the actual approach is to be a little bit avoidant, not completely, but pull back some, which in this case is just a claim on your attention and that essentially that your attention is really being claimed improperly. That's what an insecure attachment is saying, that I'm looking over here, but I really should be looking over there, or I should really be able to modulate between where I'm looking. And the avoidant person is reducing everything to being thin, another language I like. And the anxious person is expanding everything to be thick. And essentially you're over-attending somewhere and you're under-attending somewhere else. Now, the interesting thing that really makes sense with this also is attention is a currency. It's a budget. If I only have 10 units of attention, if I'm putting all 9 of them over here, one thing, I got only 1 elsewhere. And so it actually makes sense from like the natural trap for Aristoi, who's a leader, is says, I've got 1 million subjects. I can't attend each and every one of them as a human being. That's just not possible. So I have to abstract. But at the same time, when one person presents themselves, they do lean into that and they really care about this one person, but they don't then only attend to that one person, but they have a real human limit. And this is the type of thing I hear Musk talking about, like the lower people are ants. Well, to some degree for him, they have to be, because if he wants to consider all the ants, they're just ants. It's a really impossible claim on his attention. And so in this case, the problem is if I need to attend everything all the time, or I like this other omni special thing, you collapse completely. And so it's very natural that you should be what I would call, it's not actually avoidant, but you underrepresent some things because that's what's appropriate. And then you overrepresent when you can, when it's appropriate. And a healthy, mature, or secure, or Aristoi, whatever you call this person, is able to modulate their attention. And again, is full of mistakes, but they learn from the errors as they go and they update. And there's no such thing as being wrong. This is the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset. In the growth mindset, I'm just exploring the territory. And when I explore something because I fell, that wasn't a mistake. That was learning there's a hole there. And now I remember how to deal with this type of hole, hopefully. And I can share it among others, right? So this is mapping the territory. This is good. Again, here's the thing that I wanted to end with. That's the really big ticket. And it's really interesting with when I read Hannah Arendt, how like a massless group gets really anxious what happens is they look for someone else who's going to have the structure to embody that structure that they need, and they attach themselves to someone who's extremely avoidant, i.e., a megalomaniac, which they represent essentially caring. They mistake caring for exuberance or playing the game, and the person who's playing the game mistakes their exuberance or other people's desire for intimacy or connection for just exuberance, right? And so they think this is just an object saying I can win the game, and the people are like, oh, there's finally someone that cares about me. And they make the mistake because the anxious person overtly anthropomorphizes, thinking this person deeply cares about me. We're like, dude, any idiot in their sane mind, which in an emotionally regulated state, recognize this person is just out to get something and they're manipulating you. And the manipulating person would be like, so this is the key about avoidant that Stephen's getting into, but I'll get there. Is that if someone like Trump is avoidant because of all these people, the real claim is, okay, he's avoiding this. He's only put one of his pieces of attention here. There's a secret. He's got a budget of 10. Where is he anxious? And the claim is wherever you're anxious, there's a hidden avoidance. And wherever you're avoidant, there's a hidden anxious. Even the person that's totally flat about everything, they're probably anxious about death. So they're avoiding life. And the opposite would be if I'm avoiding death, I'm anxious of life. It goes to this weird balance, but it's really a claim on your attention as a currency that I'm overspending over here and I'm underspending over here. And a secure or an Aristoi is really flexible, recognizing my budget needs to be, I need to be able to learn how to use my budget properly. And I can't do that alone. And I can't let someone else tell me how to do it. We're going to do it together. We're going to figure out, like, so I'm going to model things and then the world's going to tell me how to update my model. Right. And then I don't even model things. We model things. And then we're going to, right. So the point is like that. The real claim that I'm building on with, I think this, nobody I also have read discusses anxious avoidant attachment like this as a claim on your attention. It's really about if I'm poor over here, I'm way too rich over here almost. So in this case, like I would ask anywhere, if someone's Trump is avoidant of the people, what is he anxious of? Usually the claim for power of why power begets power and corruption of power is they're just anxious about losing their power and they're avoidant of everything else, right? That's usually how it seems to be. But again, to go back to Stephen, I love this model because it gets so complex. Well, within what you're avoidant, you can look at anxious and avoidance deeper in. There's always more. It's a ones and zeros, but you can model a lot of things with ones and zeros to really do a good job. But at the same time, there's still just ones and zeros. Let's not get carried away. But they're really useful that the simple model can develop some deep complexity when you build in things like stocks and flows. And my favorite lady, Donella Meadows. I know we have lots of favorite ladies. Really, if Sharon is not here, so Sharon's like my favorite lady, you know, the anesthesiologist. But, you know, anyway, so yeah, now I've got, I guess, a third favorite lady is Hannah Arendt. But the big three for me are Donella Meadows, Hannah Arendt, and then I'm forgetting her name properly, but the lady who wrote the Second Sex and the ambiguity of ethics, I think.
Simone de Beauvoir.
Thank you, Simone de Beauvoir. Those are my big three ladies. So I'll end with that, and food for thought, guys.
Thank you, Ari. Yeah, this is good chewy stuff. So, all right. So let's hit this again. The prospect of a culture of values and a polity to garden them into harmony depends utterly on Aristoi, who live for the sake of penetrating insight into what is best and most important. Penetrating insight. Why penetrating? Because nature loves to hide, because you don't understand a thing unless you look past its surface and what is apparent to a doulos or banausos, and you figure out its character. What is it essentially? Not the inessential parts of it, but what actually is it inside? And until you know that, you can't predict the future with any plausibility, and you can't gauge values. You know, when Joe was talking about the limits of artificial intelligence, and one of the limits is that there are certain kinds of information that lend themselves to calculation. And those are the sorts of things AI can be reasonably competent with. But there are other kinds of information that are not numerical and they're not discrete. They're infinitizing. And those things do not lend themselves to calculation. I mean, if you divide by 0, it's not a number, it's an error. If you multiply by infinity, it's not a number, it's an error. As soon as you get into infinitizing values, all the math falls to pieces. And all values all issues of character and ethos are infinitizing, not finite. They're infinitizing because they interpenetrate everything. If honesty is important to you, it's not that there's one particular topic where that's relevant. It becomes relevant every goddamn time you open your mouth or act. It interpenetrates all other dimensions that you're already working with. And now, if in addition to honesty, you start working about compassion, what is the compassionate thing? So you've got a Buddhist training. You want to be honest and compassionate. Now, compassion interpenetrates all those same things, but it intersects with honesty. So you've got multiple infinities hitting everything that you're saying and doing. These are scales of infinity that discrete mathematics was not designed to be able to handle. You can't calculate these things. And so to the Banausic mind, because they're impossibilities, they just drop out of the picture as not actually being there, as not relevant. So the Aristos understands that the key to growing out of the Banausic stage of development is to is to is to learn not to put so much value on the surfaces that are apparent to Douloi and Banausoi, and to put more value onto the invisible part that they can't see, but that affects everything. The nature loves to hide, right? Says Heraclitus, that those critical parts of character have to be represented by somebody, and it isn't going to be Douloi or Banausoi. So the Aristoi have to search for them. That's what the penetrating insight is about. Because you figure out what's best and most important when you figure out what's most authoritative. And issues of character are the most authoritative. Whether it's the character of a person, or the character of a lightning bolt, or the character of a storm at sea. What is it going to do? What is it in its nature to do? Without that, you got nothing to work with. So the Aristoi focus on it. I did, on this, talking about Douloi and Banausoi and Aristoi, I did want to mention something that Ari brought up, that we can think about the bud, the blossom, and the fruit, as engagement and disengagement. So Hegel talks about the dialectic as first you negate the thing you are dissatisfied with. The Banausos negates the value system of the doulos. I don't want to be like that anymore. I'm ashamed to be like that. The kids teased me because I was too open with my feelings, and I'm going to retreat into my books and calculations. And now they can't tease me. I won't offer any vulnerability. I won't be caught without a lunch again because I'm going to plan ahead. I'm gonna outthink my competition. And so they negate the dualic worldview and mindset and value system in order to construct their Banausic worldview and mindset and system. And it takes them a while. Most of them never do, but it takes a while to become dissatisfied with Banausea as well, and to realize that it too is causing problems, and that you lost something when you gave up Doulea. You gained something, but you lost something. You're like, how can I keep the gains that I made by negating Doulea, but also recover the gains that I lost, the things that I had that I lost when I negated Doulea. And so Hegel says you negate the negation. The budding Aristos negates the Banausic mindset and says that's what I don't want to be like. And to do that, he has to partially re-engage with the things that he let go of that were part of Doulea. We're talking about attachment and avoidance, things that the doulos is attached to, that the Banausos is now avoiding. The person who transitions out of Banausea and into Aristea has to learn to re-engage with those lost parts of their doulic self. But to avoid just becoming a doulos again, they also have to not let go of the strengths that they acquired when they grew out of Doulea and into Banausea. So these issues of engagement and attachment and avoidance and negation of the negation are all, like Ari said, you have multiple ways to come back and rediscover this same cycle of phenomena that's happening in us. And so when this opening sentence in his summation of the Aristoi, it's all about the way that they are trying to get to what the Douloi and Banausoi have lost, but the only tools they have to use are the same tools right? Gnosis and noesis that the douloi and benausoi respectively have. So they have to wield them in a new way that aims towards penetrating insight as the best way to figure out what's best and most important. So I'm going to wrap up. I'm just going to run us through the words of this before we wrap up. Distinctive of the eristic ethos are its virtues of agonism, or striving for what is best, right? The struggle, the competition, protean self-cultivation, to be willing to transform yourself, to be willing to break stable parts of yourself when you realize that they're holding you back. That's the protean part, to change shape. And to do it because in order to cultivate yourself, you realize that you've outgrown this shell. You have to shed this skin. Why is the serpent wise? Because the serpent understands sometimes you have to shed your skin to grow. Respect as tolerance for difference among virtues, recognizing that monomania, monotheism, genocide, all of the things that are focused on there's one right way, that will not do for an Aristos, because that's all based on egotism, on the assumption that I know what the right way is and I'm going to force everybody to do it my way. The Aristos knows that to err is human, and he knows there needs to be a diversity of viewpoints that he can search among for penetrating insights, to give him the opportunity to figure out, when is my worldview missing something critical? Maybe Geneva sees something that I'm missing. And even though we were thinking of ourselves as opponents in this debate, maybe I realized that the only way forward is for us to put our ideas together and come up with something new that's better than what either of us had to begin with. This is an heuristic value, respect as tolerance for difference among virtues. I don't just say there's one virtue and it's the right virtue and it's my virtue and the rest of you suck. I recognize this is a conflict and we each only have a part of the picture. Drive for clarity and acuity, recognizing when we're waving our arms and vague about things, and it represents some area that we've just not explored enough. And if we haven't explored it enough, then we don't have enough penetrating insights. And that means we don't know what's best and most important. And maybe that's the area that's most decisive in the critical decision we have to make today. And here I have a great big blind spot in it. So I have to become well-rounded by searching for the areas that I'm vague in and diving into them to understand deeply enough that I can create the necessary clarity and acuity. Search for articulate insight into ultimacy. And in ultimacy, he's talking about archai, right? Principles. And in the case of ethos, the equivalent of archai is our values that make up our ethos. To try to get past the cruft and the transient stuff to, what is the most defining part here. Sacrality of intrinsic value. Sacrality, that there are sacred things. There is intrinsic value to things, immanental meaning to things, and that it's our duty to figure out what that is, and then to treat it as what it is, which is sacred. That we make sure our calculations don't run roughshod over the things that matter, that they stop at the boundaries and go, oop, got to respect that, right? No reducing people to numbers and sending them off to concentration camps. Not even if our spreadsheets say so. Not even if our ideology says so. That's a sacred boundary and we will not cross it. Our ideology has to come second, not first, to the things that are sacred. And autonomy and integrity of authentic individuality. When you find another Aristos who has cultivated themselves into a genuine person, no matter how weird and different they are, you recognize that here is a real organism, a legitimate way that a human being can be a fully adult, mature human. And that's rare enough that you have to cherish them and get to know them and learn from them, right? This is about diversity, not as tolerance. I suppose I won't murder you. This is as cherishing. My goodness, look at this wonderful thing that you have made of yourself. I didn't even know somebody could do that. It's fantastic. We all need to see you and hear from you so that we know that it can be done. And he wraps up here, to Aristoi, what is sacred is not their own biopsychological needs or money. This is shorthand for dualic values and Banausic values, power or social esteem, but only an ethos of pursuit of excellence, Aristeuian, rooted in individual character, the pursuit of arete. and excellence in the arete. What does it take for Homo sapiens to be a going concern on this planet? How can we be a thriving, successful animal that makes all of life on Earth better because we're here? Even if it's through predation, as in the case of the wolves improving Yellowstone. However it takes its form, what are the distinctive excellences that can make us really go and survive as a species? These are the things that Aristos cares about. So Aristos has figured out the money comes and goes, and often you earn it doing the worst things that are bad for everybody. And likewise, my appetites come and go, my feelings come and go. It's not that they don't matter at all. It's that they don't deserve to be master over us. And the only thing that deserves to be master over us is figuring out through penetrating insight and searching open investigation into the rights of each question what really matters below the surfaces of things, and aligning ourselves with that as the hidden harmony that people can participate in. You see, when you compare these three capsule summaries, how the definition of an Aristos is not arbitrary at all. It's absolutely necessary. If you negate Douleia to create Benauseia, and then you negate the negation and say all the problematic parts of Benauseia have to go, and we have to create a new thing that preserves the strengths of Benauseia, but recovers the lost strengths of Douleia, there's really nowhere else to go than this definition of Aristeia. It is by process of elimination. It's a kind of infinitizing ethical characterological mathematics that defines what an Aristos has to be. So we'll dig more into these three next time. We'll do the rest of this essay to wrap up our understanding of our initial understanding, that is, of the three character types. And then that will set us up the time after that to actually go into Aristoi and modernity. I hope you all had a lovely time. I certainly did.
Oh, okay.
Thanks so much,
Thanks,
Rick. This is
Rick.
great.
Yeah.
Trick.
Yeah.
And
Thanks.
David, I know you put a lot of work into this, and we don't get to see what that actually is. So I just assume. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.